Good morning, everybody. A warm welcome from Graz to all of you and to the beginning of our conference, unfortunately only at virtual level, not as we had planned it for 2 years now already, to meet in Graz also personally. This is, an interesting time we live in, as the Chinese used to say. And the project on migration, integration, and religious diversity now comes to an end. And I will talk a little bit about that more in a moment. But I'm also very happy that the Dean of the Faculty of Law gives us the honor to say a few words of welcome to us. Professor Bezemek, you have the floor, please.
Thank you so much, dear Professor Marco, dear Joseph. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure to be with you here today, even if only Professor Marco already indicated as much virtually. We would have loved to welcome you on site here in Graz at the Faculty of Law at a conference that we deem of prior importance. It is something that you deal with over the course of this conference that has been occupying scholars from the very early days of statehood, and it will keep on occupying those working scholarly on questions of statehood and religion for generations to come. So the discourse that you are having is something of the very essence of political theory, constitutional law and theory, and things that we are considering at the very core at the Institute of Legal Foundations, where Professor Marco now is a senior advisor also to our global governance department. And we take great pride that we can host today's conference under his direction and expertise. Also, and in particular, because we are convinced here at the Faculty of Law at University of Graz that an interdisciplinary approach to law and legal questions, and thus also to questions of legal and political theory, is key to understanding and facing the various challenges that our time poses, and specifically, of course, when it comes to the interrelation of law and religion. Without the deeper understanding, without the dialogue necessary to reach this deeper understanding, the law alone cannot provide the answer. Thus, against that backdrop, I'm amazed that so many scholars have answered Professor Marco's call today, many of whose work I have studied closely in the past, and I wish the conference a very successful course, evidently, and I wish you a pleasant time, even if spent only online, in discussing and deliberating, and I'm sure it will be fruitful and rich, as the contents of the conference have already been promising. And thus, without further ado, a warm welcome here at Graz, even if only virtually. We hope to welcome you on site as soon as possible. Back to you, Joseph, and best of luck for your discussions.
Thank you so much, Spectabilis. As you see, we are all very traditional in our honors, and many thanks for your warm welcome of all the participants for this conference. Let me say a few words on the conference itself and on the project itself. Most of you know already that this is a research project now running for 3 years already, based on an interdisciplinary project within the University of Graz in the collaboration of the Faculty of Law with the Faculty of Theology, so that we have participants dealing from the perspective of law, political sciences, theology, religious sciences, and sociology, with the overall topic of migration, integration, and religious diversity. In addition to that, we have a few Austrian partners collaborating with us in the course of this project, Professor Sedini from University of Innsbruck, but also Professor Aslan from University of Vienna and Professor Kalb from the University of Linz, who published together with one of my colleagues already a book on Islam in Austria from the legal perspective, so that we have already an edited book as one of the results of the project. In addition to that, we were able to hire several research assistants also for this project, because this project is financed in collaboration of University of Graz with the Ministry of Science. And we are very thankful to both institutions, the Ministry of Science as well as the University of Graz, for this very important financial support. And in addition to that, we can say already we had some success, also some sort of success. And when I say we, the partners of the project, Professor Weira, who is already present, of course, was very successful also to win an additional grant in the field of religious education for co-teaching in religious education. And of course, my best congratulations for that. The other partner now we have within the project is Professor Winter, and we are very thankful on the side of the law faculty that we have such an opportunity to collaborate with our colleagues from the Faculty of Theology. And of course, in the meantime, all these research assistants we have hired, either in progress or even finishing their PhD thesis, together with me, Professor Weira and Professor Winter, or have published, of course, also several articles in national and international journals, as well as papers for what we call here in Austria, from the university management perspective, publications from science to public. Let me come with that as the chair of the first panel, also to the starting, to the start for the first panel. And I'm very happy to have Christina Stöckl from University of Innsbruck with us this morning. Hello from Graz to Innsbruck, a warm hello. And when we discuss the topic of religion, state, and secularization as the overall challenge for our discussions and debates, a starting point could be, of course, a huge question mark with regards to secularization. What is the meaning of the very concept of secularization? Is it really one of the benchmarks, one of the basic characteristics of what we call modernity and the modern state, based on the conception of a separation, of an institutional separation of states and churches on the one hand, and of course the justiciability of individual rights, in particular the individual right to freedom of religion. And in the course of the last 200 years, when talking about processes of secularization, of course, not only freedom of religion, but also freedom from religion. And Ahmed Kuru, who will be on the panel this afternoon, has already made an important distinction with regard to the comparison of three countries, of Turkey, France, and the United States, by making a categorical distinction between what he calls the assertive secularism, the French Republican model, based on the strict constitutional principle of laïcité, which means, of course, not only a separation of state and church, but also a separation of politics and religion, so that religion shall become more or less a private affair, a private feeling of individuals. And of course, the question is raised here with regards to the topic of Christina Stöckl. Is this really a European, an overall European or a universal concept, or is it simply a Western concept developed over the last centuries in Western Europe and Northern America? So that she tries to figure out with the case study on the Russian Orthodoxy, the processes of desecularization, and of course brings in various theoretical perspectives on what she calls post-secularity, and tries to make us aware of the internal differences also within the Russian Orthodoxy, and the multiple character, as she calls it, of Russian Orthodoxy. But she comes to the conclusion in the end, in particular with the constitutional amendments of 2020 in the Russian Federation, that Orthodoxy has more or less the status of a civil religion, which is complicit with the authoritarian autocratic structures of the Russian or state or the Russian Federation. And therefore the question, the old question of Slavophiles versus Westerners, has anything changed in Russia today? Or how shall we see the latest developments in the Russian Federation, in particular when we also take into consideration the case law of the Russian Constitutional Court dealing with freedom of religion, and taking into account, for instance, also the very interesting fact for me that Jehovah's Witnesses are seen as a terrorist organization under the law in Russia, whereas the European Court of Human Rights has handed down a very important case in Jehovah's Witnesses versus Austria, forcing more or less the Austrian legal system to adapt a little bit more to the question of equality between different religious denominations. Without any further ado, therefore, many thanks for joining us today. Professor Stöckl has studied comparative linguistics and Russian language at the University of Innsbruck. If I'm informed correctly, then holds a master title in international relations and European studies from the Central European University in Budapest at that time, and finally a PhD from the University Institute in Fiesole on social and political sciences, and has concentrated and focused in her postdoc studies before coming to Innsbruck, finally as a full professor of sociology on the sociology of religion. You have the floor.
Thank you, Professor Marco, for this very kind introduction, and thank you, especially Kerstin Wonisch, for inviting me to this conference. For my talk, I've prepared a presentation, and I will now try to share it, and I see that this also works, so that's good. Now, this conference has been a moving target for the last 2 years, and as scholars, our thinking never stops. And so for this reason, I think that with respect to the abstract I wrote some 2 years ago, I have definitely moved on, and my focus today, of my talk today, will be less on the Russian case, but rather on what the Russian case is in the European panorama of what I call recontesting secularism in Europe. And I should also make a caveat. So the role of Orthodox Christianity in the title is very much geared towards my analysis of Russian Orthodoxy. And I think most of that holds true for many of the Orthodox churches in Eastern Europe, with the exception, I would say, of Orthodoxy in the Western diaspora, especially in the United States, where we have a much more variegated panorama, and also of the Ecumenical Patriarchate in Constantinople. Constantinople. So this is a kind of caveat before I start. Having said that, my presentation will start and end with the Russian case. And I'm glad that this is a big conference and we will have a lot of time to discuss about secularism, secularization, and Europe. And if I can do one thing in the context of this conference, I want to bring in the Cold War and the experience of communism as a very important experience and point of reference that still determines many ways in which the religious secular arrangements function today. Even if for the people who are involved in living through these arrangements in their everyday lives, communism may no longer be a living experience and a personal experience. So by way of introduction, I want to start with, well, one would say with the question, what questions do you ask after an experience of communism? The British historian Orlando Figes has published a book entitled The Whisperers, Private Life in Stalin's Russia, which is based largely on oral history archives that are contained in the Memorial Foundation archives. And the book focuses not so much on the people who during the Great Purges perished in the Gulag, but it's focused on the people that were left behind, on their children, very often on their parents. So on those that remained in the cities and in the shadow of the fate of people who perished in the Gulag. And there is one story in that book towards the end that is very striking. It's about a woman called Antonina, who in the period of perestroika and encouraged by the works of Memorial and by more open discourse about about secrets, is encouraged to tell her family that at the age of 20, she has reinvented her biography and she has hidden from her family for her whole life the fact that her parents were condemned as enemies of the people and died in the Gulag. So she reinvented her biography in order to attend university. And in that moment, she finds out that also her ex-husband has reinvented his biography and never shared that fact with his wife. And she realizes that her broken marriage had been one of silences. Now, in the 1990s, there was a lot of talk inside Russia about a great moral and spiritual crisis. And especially demographic trends really worried the Russian public. Birth rates went down, mortality rates went up, life expectancy went down, divorces went up, less families were founded. There was a demographic crisis that was accompanied by a lot of dramatic comparisons, a demographic catastrophe, a demographic tragedy, the extinction of the Russian people that's looming over Russian society in this early post-Soviet period. So the question I want to start with is, what questions do you ask? And then, what answers do individuals and institutions, and what answers does the church give? The Russian Orthodox Church and the Moscow Patriarchate, they've given a very clear answer. They said that what Russia needs is a return to traditional values. Traditional values as those that are sort of the Orthodox Christian tradition, as a long-standing historical and cultural tradition, as a specific doctrine and teaching, and that can withstand influences from outside, in particular from the West, and from a liberal social vision and political vision, because this could bring forward destructive social and cultural factors. I leave it at this because this was an introduction, and I just want to remind you, I will come back to this fact and to the question, what questions do you ask and what answers come first? Let's take a step back and consider for a moment the panorama of secular religious arrangements, which basically the Western European North Atlantic world has found in the post-war period. There are two big concepts that loom here, very large. One is desecularization and the other is post-secularity. They also emerged kind of around the same time, both in the 1990s, trying to sort of catch a dynamic of what many sociologists call the return of religion. Now, Peter Berger said this is not really return of religion. Religion has always been around. And in the book, Desecularization of the World, he really conceptualizes religion as the foe of the secular order, as secularity's foe. So he really sort of conceptualizes a contesting of the secular order by religious actors. By secular order, he means basically the separation of religion and politics. And so what the goal is of a dynamic of desecularization from the side of religious actors is basically a form of theopolitics, sort of re-religionizing the collective decision-making in a specific political community, or in the absence sort of the mobilizing power to do that, the panoramic polarization. We get polarization between sort of those who identify with the secular and those who identify with the religious approach to collective decision-making, which is what politics is about. The counter concept was Jürgen Habermas' post-secular society. And Jürgen Habermas really thought about religion, the return of religion, as the return of religion as secularity's sparring partner, so to speak, as that what secular order and religious order have to, yes, sort of get into conversation, into dialogue. He uses the word dialogue and deliberation with each other in order to overcome the secularist order. And by secularist order, he means a politics that turns a blind eye to religion, that makes it difficult for religious citizens to voice their instances, and that is therefore treating religious citizens unequally. So the idea of Habermas in post-secular society was at one and the same time very optimistic, and it was very simple. It was basically the idea of equality that should not make a distinction between religious arguments and non-religious arguments, at least prima facie, so where it sets out. So the goal of post-secular society, of post-secularity as a concept, was pluralism for collective decision-making in that what politics is about, and a pluralist vision of that. So that's a very simple, distinction. But of course, these distinctions do not come out of nowhere. I mean, they really are sort of theorizations of institutions, which by the 1990s were rather firmly in place. And I want to sort of substantiate this. Western Europe after the Second World War was characterized by two regimes of secular religious arrangements. In Western Europe, we basically had three models. The state church model, let's think about the Lutheran churches in the Nordic countries, cooperation models, where churches are recognized as bodies of public law. Austria, Germany are examples for that. And the laicist model, our standard example is always France. Under the umbrella of these three models of religion-state relations, the main two Christian churches in Western Europe, so the Catholic Church and the Protestant churches, they really developed in a way that sort of saw them as public religions as sparing partners of the secular order. And a very clear institutional expression of that are the two representations of the bishops' conferences of these two large Christian churches to the European Union. The Catholic Church founded the Comité, the Council of the European Bishops to the European institutions in 1980, and the Protestant churches, the Communion of Protestant Churches in Europe in 1973. So the churches really sort of institutionally engaged in dialogue, or sought at least to engage in some kind of dialogue and representation with secular political institutions. The other secular religious arrangement that dominated Europe was, of course, that in Eastern Communist Europe, which was really one of sort of a repressive state atheism or repressive secularism vis-a-vis religions on the territory. But then we, of course, know that this repression of simple believers, making life very hard for people who continue to be believers in their careers, that was, everyday practice in communist Eastern Europe, that went hand in hand with a political co-optation of the religious institutions, of the hierarchies, of the church leadership. And that's not only true for the Moscow Patriarchate, which was clearly co-opted by the communist leadership in the Soviet Union. Also, other religious organizations and groups were co-opted by governments. Not only the Christians, also the Islamic community in Soviet Union, for example. There's a lot of research on that. So these were, in a way, two arrangements. One was kind of that of an idea of partnership, to a certain extent, sparing partners, and the other one was repressive. The other model, which you're all well aware of, is the way that the United States went. And here the secular religious arrangement was, of course, disestablishment. And under that umbrella of disestablishment, we see from the 1950s, especially in the 1970s onwards, that developing, which then James Davis and Hunter calls the culture wars. The culture wars are very much a polarization inside American society over issues of family, art, education, law, politics, religious freedom, where we kind of first have sort of Christian, that then becomes the term Christian right groups, so conservative Christian groups that oppose progressive trends of liberalization in American society. This opposition to progressivism in American society is very much connected with anti-communism, and sometimes maybe we tend to forget that in the 1920s, American anti-communism, in the absence of really strong economic sort of proletarian working class communism, was very much a phenomenon against what then was called social Marxism or the social left. So the idea that communism was really a threat to the American family. There's a very good book, which I've put on the slide, by Erica Ryan, Red War on the Family, about what she calls the first Red Scare period in the 1920s. Then, of course, we have the second Red Scare period around McCarthyism. But then from the 1970s onwards, the rise of the American Christian right, the foe that is identified are very often sort of Marxism, leftism. And so this is, in a way, a panorama I wanted to give you, these two slides on so Western Europe, Eastern Europe, and the US during the Cold War. And let's now see in what becomes of that with the end of the Cold War. And I've called the second part Orthodox ways of recontesting the secular, because what I want to sort of quickly talk you through is that I think the Russian Orthodox Church has really gone through several stages of imagining itself as a public religion in these last 30 years, trying out the different models that I've just described. The Russian Orthodox Church entered the post-Soviet period with a self-identity of having survived militant secularism, that is, communist atheism. So as being that church that has resisted and that has endured and that is still around. And in the 90s and in the 0 years, I think we can say there were clear indicators that the Moscow Patriarchate imagined its public role following the European cooperation models. The Russian constitution declared the Russian state as secular. It included sort of the recognition of religious actors, but on paper on par. So it didn't introduce a strong hierarchy between majority religious groups, minority religious groups. And if you just look at sort of the external relations of the Moscow Patriarchate at the time, it's very interesting that very early on, the Moscow Patriarchate created a representation to the European Union. And it's an institution that still exists as the Department for External Trade Relations of the Moscow Patriarchate, but it has changed its name, or let's say it has changed the name of the website. But I think it's significant because the website's name at the time was orthodoxeurope.org. So first of all, what is behind this is the claim that Russian Orthodoxy can speak for Orthodox Europe, but it also means that orthodoxy matters in Europe. So the fact that this very early on was among the priorities of external relations to enter into the European institutions as a type of sparring partner, I think is significant. And also internally, there were signs that the Russian Orthodox Church, the Moscow Patriarchate at the time, tried to define itself as an entity that is very much vis-a-vis the Russian state. A very much discussed article of the social doctrine of the Russian Orthodox Church, published in the year 2000, was the one on civil disobedience, where the church sort of claims, in the solemn way that these doctrines are claimed, and I put the picture there to understand that it was a very solemn document published by the Bishops' Council of the Russian Orthodox Church. The church remains loyal to the state, but if authority forces Orthodox believers to apostatize, the church should refuse to obey the state. So this was a strong sentence in the context of Russian Orthodoxy. The church refused to obey the state. Isn't that a really big break with all sort of historical tradition of symphonic, harmonious religion-state relations? I mean, maybe that one paragraph has been overinterpreted at the time, but definitely a lot of ink has been spent on trying to understand what that meant in the year 2000. I think we see now that it didn't mean too much, but with hindsight, I do sort of interpret it as part of a phase where also the Russian Orthodox Church saw itself in terms of religion-state relations and the arrangements, the models that were out there, more in tune with the standard Western European cooperation models. And this, I think, has changed. I think this has changed. And in my recent research, we have actually tried to identify the moments where this has changed, where the Russian Orthodox Church and important actors inside that church sort of rethink their role. And I've called it maybe sort of rather forcefully to joining that the Russian Orthodox Church at that moment joins the global culture wars, that it really sees itself much more in an optic of being a foe of the secular state, of the secular order, that resembles more the American culture wars than the European cooperation models. And one example I want to give for that is a website that was created by what is now the representation of Moscow Patriarchate to the European institutions. It's a website entitled orthodoxrights.org. It's a website that monitors the rights and freedom of Orthodox Christians in Europe. It works very much like Human Rights Watch or another human rights NGO, only that, so they publish reports, they publish news, only that it particularly looks at sort of the defense of religious freedom of Orthodox Christians. And at the moment, it basically targets cases in Ukraine. So we have the ongoing conflict in Ukraine between the Moscow Patriarchate and the newly founded Orthodox Church of Ukraine is now sort of played out as a human rights issue, where the Orthodox Church acts as a human rights advocate, but in a clearly sort of politicized key. The Moscow Patriarchate has joined other global culture war battles and sites of battles. I give just one more example. It was the World Summit in Defense of Persecuted Christians, organized by the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association in Washington, D.C. in 2017, co-organized with the Moscow Patriarchate. So it's noteworthy that we have here an inter-religious collaboration that is not apparent, Orthodox Christianity and the Billy Graham Evangelistic Association, on a topic that is very high up on the agenda in the global culture wars, defense of Christians. And here again, so what I meant with joining the global culture wars, there are cases that we see where this is happening. Another case that we have studied in our recent research is that of Russian Orthodox NGOs and organizations and social movements that become active as transnational moral norm entrepreneurs, especially in the pro-family movement. One example here we had on the case of the World Congress of Families, but also in the global homeschooling movement, or in anti-abortion mobilization. I want to draw your attention to a forthcoming monograph that I have written with a colleague from Russia on this very panorama of Russian Orthodoxy joining the global culture wars, where we bring these cases together, that will be published next year with Fordham. And finally, this is my final example on sort of Russian Orthodoxy joining the global culture wars. Is what I really want to stress is that this is something relative. I do think this is relatively new. Also, the fact that Russian Orthodoxy recognizes itself as a religious actor that is sort of active not only through the insight to Russia or the other nations where the Russian Orthodox Church is present, but it really is conversant with religious groups across the globe. One clear example of that is a website that has been created in multiple languages by a social conservative NGO called Citizen Go. This is a campaigning website, so they publish petitions that can be signed online, and it exists in 14 languages. And the content that is posted on this campaigning website is very often translated into all these languages. So here I give you one example of the US-American website and the Russian website, and you see it's the same campaign, the same pictures and text, it's just having been translated. So we do not only see sort of a strategic collaboration between actors of the different denominations, we also see a translation of contents. And here I come back again to this question of, what experience does a society have? What questions does it ask? And what answers does it find? We are in a context where answers have become transnational. They are offered out there. So a family crisis is sort of the result of progressive leftist mobilization. That's the cause of a family crisis. That's not an answer that necessarily arises out of the Russian experience. This is in a way what I wanted to show with that example, starting with Orlando Fix. That's an answer that's out there on the plate in a global Christian right that has always seen itself in the battle with what they call the social Marxism. So what I find really striking, I was 12 when the Berlin Wall fell, so for me really this is a history that is in the past, and I have students who weren't even born when the Berlin Wall fell, and I somehow feel as I'm studying this transnational global culture war mobilization that there are trends and dynamics that function as if nothing really has changed, so this so anti-communism is still there, very, very prominent, only that the communists are now the others, sort of people who mobilize for gender rights, people who mobilize for transgender rights. So the question really is, and how do I conclude a talk like that? I think that religion in the 21st century is, we are very much in front of two dynamics. So we have religious actors that dream of a kind of epistemic reconquista of the political sphere. They see themselves as being in a context of desecularization, of a polarization, that ultimate goal could either be a reconquista or polarization. And at the same time, we have religious actors who continue to do what they've done in the last 50 years, namely sort of exercise kind of an epistemic humility in a post-secular society type of way. And so we also have a fraction inside the religious communities. And I think this is very clear across the board. So we have conservative grassroots that mobilize, and tendentially more moderate, at least in the Catholic Church, moderate leaderships will try to keep the situation at bay. Noteworthy is the transnational and interdenominational character of this phenomenon. And noteworthy is also the Russian Orthodox aspiration to leadership in these sort of newly vigorated global culture wars. Okay, I leave it at that, and I think we will have time to discuss and hopefully get a fuller picture with all the other interesting presentations that we will have. I will post a link to our research and to the publication so you can follow up on what we've done on this topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Christina, for these very fascinating insights you have presented to us. I would like now to give the possibility to the participants also to ask questions, to make comments. And as far as I can see, already Mikhail Antonov also present, and Dino Abazovic from Bosnia also present now already in this conference. Maybe they would like to break the ice with the first question. So, Mikhail, yes, Mikhail, please, yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Marco. Thank you so much, Professor Stöckel, for your interesting presentation. I've tried to make sense of this question and open questions and answers function, but don't see how it works. So your idea, Professor Stöckel, that the Russian Orthodox Church is participating in global cultural wars is very interesting, and I would like to know which are, in your opinion, among the other Christian and other religious denominations, are allies and probably antagonists of the Russian Church in this kind of cultural wars.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think I know that the culture wars are globalizing. That's not something we discovered. Scholars have been discussing this since the early 1990s, but it was always clear that the actors who globalized the culture wars were American Christian right groups, mostly Protestant and evangelical. And the religious actors that joined forces were countries of the Islamic organization and the Vatican, the Holy See. So in the 1990s, when we first speak about globalization of the culture wars, in the context of the great UN conferences in Beijing and Cairo on women's rights and reproductive rights, the main actor of global culture wars, so to speak, was the Vatican. And I think now we are sort of 30 years almost have passed, and at least inside the Vatican, with the arrival of Pope Francis, the situation has very much changed. So there is, I think, now an aspiration of other groups to take over, because Pope Francis has made it very clear that he doesn't see that as sort of a central goal of his papacy. And until shortly before Pope Benedict XVI stepped down, the Russian Orthodox Church did dream about an alliance with the Vatican and the Holy See. But I think this is sort of ended. Now, so you are saying who are the antagonists now? I think in a way it is definitely some churches, like the German Protestant churches, that have been very critical of the Moscow Patriarchate. Some groups inside the Catholic Church as well that have reacted very critically. And then finally, that other part of the Orthodox Commonwealth, the Ecumenical Patriarchate of Constantinople, and especially certain one of more progressive groups inside the Orthodox Church of America. So I think we have new cleavages that run through the religious denominations themselves, and that have they have created new balances of influence and power inside the panorama of what I call it the global culture wars that has existed for quite a long time already.
Okay, thank you. Are there any additional questions before I hand over the floor to Professor Barker? If this is not the case,
actually I have raised my hand. I wonder whether you didn't see it.
Yeah, please.
Okay. Yeah,
please
thanks
go
very
ahead.
much.
Yeah.
Thanks very much for this interesting presentation. You used this wonderful phrase of epistemic humility and pointed out that there is a kind of struggle going on among the Christians in the world, of course. And I understood you saying also within the Russian Orthodox Church. And I'm just curious, to your estimation, how strong are the voices within the Russian Orthodox Church advocating a kind of epistemic humility instead of favoring the other missionary and more dominant approach?
Thank you so much.
Yes, I think that what you now call the missionary dominant approach, which I very much associate with the current Moscow Patriarchate, is contested inside Russia from two sides. So it's contested from the side of groups that in the Russian context are called liberal groups, by who we would maybe mean sort of more pluralistically minded pro-democratic groups inside the Russian Orthodox Church that exist. You know, priests and parishes exist, and one sign of life of these rather small and also weakened groups was a letter of protest published in 2019 against the treatment of protesters by the police. So we have a certain group of let's say, yes, liberal Orthodox priests, but I don't like the term liberal here. But anyway, priests, it would like a different type of church, a more pro-democratic church. We have that, especially in the urban centers in Russia. But then this type of globalizing agenda of the Moscow Patriarchate is also contested by very conservative groups inside the Russian Orthodox Church that really resist any kind of ecumenical contact or any contact with other religious groups. And so there is actually a very strong, and I think it's stronger than the liberal opposition. There is an ultra-Orthodox or a fundamentalist opposition to this agenda. And in that sense, I think somehow the Moscow Patriarchate is very lonely with this agenda. It has more friends to the outside and in the Kremlin than maybe really backing inside the Russian Orthodox Church today.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
I have also now the opportunity to say hello to all our followers, and on the stream we have by now 74 followers of the conference, and they have also the possibility to ask questions. And there is one question I want to forward to you. What is the role of Vienna as a hub of Christian NGOs in the global culture wars? And the lady who is asking this question is asking things about ADF and OIDIC and their lobbyism in European institutions and their reports to the OECD, in particular the last OECD report from November 2021.
Yes, I think it's true. I think Vienna is an important hub of Christian NGOs. So ADF is Alliance Defending Freedom International. This is it's a typical example of the American Christian right globalizing. ADF has existed for several decades in the US before it created an international branch. It's a law firm, and ADF has brought cases from Europe all the way up to the European Court of Human Rights. One recent case was, for example, case of the family Wunderlich on trying to bring Germany into having to legalize homeschooling as a practice. And ADF is very active. So, and the same about OECD. The website I showed before, the Orthodox Rights website, OECD has become a main site of contestation of what we mean by religious freedom, and in many of these European cases, especially now Ukraine. So I think the role of Vienna is in that sense special, that it now hosts many of these institutions, which is maybe also not surprising given that Vienna hosts other international institutions.
Thank you so much. Due to time constraints, now we have to go ahead on our agenda, and it is my honor and pleasure to announce Professor Eileen Barker as the next speaker. She is Professor Emeritus at the Department of Sociology of London School of Economics, and her main research has always been, for decades now, her interest in cults, sects, and new religious movements, and also with regard to Eastern Europe, she has been also investigating changes in the religious situation in the post-communist countries of Eastern Europe, but also China and the Far East. So I think that this is some sort of interrelationship with the first speaker, to have this experience from Eastern Europe. And thank you so much for participating in our conference, and you have the floor. And please, 20 minutes is a time limit for all the speakers, is still one of the rules. Microphone, please. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, I'm talking, as our chair has said, on the protection or persecution and the state, the law, and religious minorities. Different states respond in different ways to minority religions, obviously enough. They may be welcoming or accepting or ignoring or attacking, and different religious minorities react in different ways to different states and legislation. They may accommodate or ignore or attack or polarize. And these processes have different consequences for individuals, and minority religions have different consequences for different sections of society. And of course, this changes the whole time. State protection, my basic assumption is that a primary function of the state is to protect its citizens, all of its citizens, from a variety of external and internal threats. And they differ in their focus when it's considered that one group of citizens might need to be protected from another group of citizens. And this could be either that they protect non-minority religion citizens from minority rights, minority religions, or they protect the minority religions from non-members. And I'd like to propose two ideal types in the Weberian sense between states. What I'm going to call the before states and the after states. And the before states try to prevent an anticipated harm by minority religions to the rest of society. And the after states protect minority religions from discrimination or persecution. The before states, the minority religions are defined as an ever-present threat, whereas the after states, they're presumed innocent until they're proved guilty. The before states try to control the religious minorities, whereas the after states just treat them as normal parts of the society. The before states target the new religions, minority religions in the law, and the after states see everyone as being equal before all the laws. And examples of the before states would be China, Russia, France, and Turkey. And for the after states, there'd be the USA, the UK, Japan, and Scandinavia. A special rapporteur, when it was Asma Jahangir, said in her general report that the most prominent example of a general worrying pattern all over the world is discrimination and violence suffered by members of religious minorities. And many religious minorities are in a vulnerable situation, which is further aggravated when states specifically target them. And there are such things as admissions to schools and certain kinds of employment in the government and private enterprises that have denied them. And she goes on and talks about various other things. And then Jonathan Fox, in a book called Thou Shalt Have No Other Gods Before Me, Why Governments Discriminate Against Religious Minorities, looked at data between 1990 and 2014, and he discovered that 88.5% of 183 governments did discriminate against 3/4 of 771 minority religions. And for minority religions, he was taking those religions that had at least 0.2% of the country's population. And I suspect that if he had included, which would be technically very difficult, those with even less percentage, the discrimination would have been much greater. And he also discovered that discrimination had increased over this period. And he joined forces with E.T. Peretz in another publication. And he compared discrimination by 37 Western democracies against 4 religious minorities that governments perceive as cults. And these were Jehovah's Witnesses, Church of Scientology, Unification Church or the Moonies, and the Latter-day Saints or Mormons. And for discrimination, they meant restrictions being placed on the religious institutions or practices of minority religions, which are not also placed on the majority religions. And these could be things like the necessity to register to be a legal person or have special status, anti-religious propaganda in government publications, restrictions of building permits, leasing and repairing or maintaining places of worship, and mandatory education in the majority religion, and various other things as well. Now, of course, legislative bodies aren't just the government. It isn't just the government that can affect minority religions through the law. There's the United Nations at the widest level, and there's the European Union, ASEAN, Sharia, are sort of regional law declarations and things that apply. Then you have governments, which might be federal governments, and then states or cantons or provinces. And then local government also can produce bylaws about zoning and things like that. And all of these can react in different ways to the new religions or the minority religions. And it isn't always necessarily the higher court that trumps the lower court. There's the margin of appreciation, which gives state's kind of wriggle room. If something is, a law is passed at the higher level, they can get out of it sometimes, or they can just defy or ignore, which Russia has done in quite a number of cases when they've been directed to do something different by the European Court of Human Rights. And of course, the application of the law, whether the law exists or not, isn't always neutral. For example, when deprogramming, illegally kidnapping people from minority religions was rife in Western Europe and North America, very often a blind eye was turned by the authorities for this going on. Now, state actions, there are a large number of different things that states can do which will discriminate or perhaps help the new religions, depending on whether they're before or after states. There's the internal declarations, which are mainly supportive of the minority religions, the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights, and most people, I'm sure, are familiar with Article 18, etc., giving individuals the right to practice, believe, change, manifest their religions. And but there are also the things in Article 29, which point out that everyone has duties to the community and that their rights and freedoms do have certain limitations. And these can be concerned with respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for the requirements of morality, public order, and general welfare. And these get-out clauses are used quite frequently in producing what the minority religions consider to be discrimination against them. And the European Convention on Human Rights also has its limitations, referring to things like health and morals and the rights and freedoms of others and public order. There's a very important declaration on the rights of religious minorities that came out in 1992, which isn't always remembered, but it stresses that religious minorities should have the right to practice freely. But it also had exceptions when specific practices are in violation of national law or contrary to international standards. And here it's open to quite a lot of interpretation as well. I just want to give you a couple of examples of the European Court on Human Rights, which have actually been declared in the last 10 days or so. And one is the Hare Krishna movement against Russia, which was an Article 9 case on freedom of religion. And the court said that Russia had failed to protect the religious, the Hare Krishna's religious organization and their beliefs from hostile speech used by regional state authorities in anti-cult publications, derogatory language, unsubstantiated allegations, and the margin of appreciation, their wiggle room, had been overstepped. And they also introduced Article 11 on freedom of peaceful assembly, which Russia hadn't been allowing. Whether Russia will pay any attention to this or not, we'll have to see. And then the other one, which came out on the same day, 23rd of November, drew on quite a lot of articles from the convention: expulsion of foreign nationals, freedom of movement, freedom of religion, interference with family life, degrading treatment. The person concerned was placed in a cell overnight without any provision for meeting basic needs, which means he couldn't go to the toilet. He was allowed on one occasion. And unlawful detention. And here again, Russia has been ticking, the European Court has been ticking off Russia. However, the margin of, what's it called, margin of, I've forgotten the net, the wriggle room thing does work sometimes, margin of appreciation. And the French ban on full veil was upheld by the European Court. And you've got the ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, having a human rights declaration, which is like one would expect. But the member states include states like Indonesia and Vietnam, which aren't exactly known for their lack of discrimination of minority religions. In Indonesia, there are only 6 official religions, and you're meant to belong to one of those. It varies a bit in different times in different parts of Indonesia, which is, of course, the largest Islamic country. But some other religions are allowed. But for example, in 2011, 26 of the regional governments enacted restrictions on the Ahmadiyya community. Pakistan, of course, is much worse as far as the Ahmadiyya are concerned. The government failed to enforce a Supreme Court decision in favor of construction permit for the Indonesian Christian church, the Yasmin Church. And it failed to prevent attacks and combat discrimination against religious groups by non-state actors. And it didn't hold perpetrators of violence accountable. In Sharia law, Islamic governments vary in the ways that the law is interpreted and how the minority religions are treated. Sometimes it's very harshly. In Saudi Arabia, non-Muslims can't be citizens, but most well known is that apostasy is punishable by death. It very rarely happens, but it is and has been sometimes practiced. This Christian convert priest was hanged for apostasy, and 7 of people, including his supporters, Christians, were killed extrajudicially since 1979, the Iranian Revolution, for apostasy. And this pregnant Sudanese woman was sentenced to death by hanging in Khartoum court because she wouldn't renounce her Christianity. But Amnesty launched a great big campaign about this and got over 1 million people actively calling for the Sudanese authorities to let her off. And they say that the authorities, because the authorities heard these calls, she was saved and eventually allowed free. And it's quite interesting that there are these human rights pressure groups that can help those who are sentenced in this way. State actions, constitutions differ, whether they're theocracies, establishment, laicite, or separation of church and state. But nearly all of them include some kind of freedom of religion clause. Then, of course, there's legislation, general laws about religions, some of which, like those on proselytization and apostasy, might be particularly relevant for minority religions. And then there are laws about specific religions. These may be giving privileges to state religions, established religions, but they could be restricting and could lead to the necessity for what the Chinese call re-education, or they can be banned or liquidated, to use Russia's terminology. These are just some of the minority religions, the cases that minority religions have been involved in. And I've put in red the ones that are particularly tied with minority religions, and the ones underlined like conscientious objection, blood transfusions, extremist literature registration, and saluting the flag in America are ones that apply just to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Well, not just, but certainly to the Jehovah's Witnesses. Then we have reports. Lots of governments have asked for reports to be looking into minority religions. And James Richardson and Massimo Intrivina have made distinction between what they call type 1 reports, such as in France, Belgium, Russia, and the European Parliament, the two by Hunt and Cottrell. These have led to an inflation of moral panics. They say very often that cults and sects are distinguished from religions. They're not proper religions. And they are involved in things like brainwashing and mind control. And people who leave them are defined as having been victims. And the reporters have turned to anti-cultists rather than to scholars as their resource. Whereas in type 2 religions, such as Germany or Berger's European Parliament one, or the Netherlands, Canada, and Sweden, these have used scholars for their information. And this has led to a greater awareness of the complexity, and usually the conclusion that the existing laws are sufficient to deal with any misdemeanors or criminal activity. Sometimes, of course, because of things that minority religions do, the new laws have to be created. But of course, new laws have been created the whole time anyway. But these should apply to everyone, whether they're a Mooni or a Methodist or a Muslim or what have you. Also, some of these reports have produced lists of what they consider to be sects, dangerous sects. The French Vivian report had 172 of these sects, and the Belgians had 184 in their report, which included religions that are quite often thought of as mainstream, like the Quakers or the YWCA, not the YMCA for some reason. Now, these lists weren't enacted by law, but they did have and still have very real consequences. If you're on the list, you might find it difficult to get employment or to rent a hall to meet in, or for your children to get special kinds of education. Then states can also have control over registration, that in order to have certain privileges or, well, yes, certain privileges certainly, or have privileges taken away if you're not registered. You don't have to register your religion in places like America, North America, or the United Kingdom. Sometimes to be registered, you have to have a certain number, for example, 20,000 members in Slovakia, or have been in the country for a certain length of time, whether it's 15 years or 100 years to be a particular kind of, for a particular kind of registration in Lithuania. And obviously new religious movements, are at a great disadvantage if you're having numbers or length of time as part of the reason why you can register. I asked a Danish person who was responsible for bringing up a list of religions that could be registered for carrying out marriages, and I asked about the criteria, and his answer was, well, it helps to be mainstream. The consequences of registration can be privileges, but then your credentials for being given these privileges have to be checked, and they can be checked in peculiar ways sometimes. If you're not registered and you're not a legal status, then it's very difficult to operate in a lot of different ways. And you could be liquidated in Russia or sent for re-education, imprisonment in the Chinese People's Republic. Individual registration, there's quite a lot of difficulties there. For example, you might have to put your religion on your ID card, and it's a bit difficult if your religion doesn't happen to be one of the acceptable religions. And then unless you lie and say that you've belonged to a religion that you don't belong to, you're in deep trouble in a whole lot of different ways. Just a couple of examples about registration in the Baltic countries for pagans. Lithuanian law distinguishes between traditional, non-traditional registered religions and non-registered religious associations. And all of them can conduct religious services and engage in educational charities, charitable activities. But the registered ones that are recognized by the state do have certain privileges, such as being able to conduct weddings or have airtime or religious education. And they can ask the state for recognition, and this has been granted to quite a few minority religions. Catholicism, of course, is the majority religion in Lithuania. Baptists and Methodists, etc., have had it granted. And Romuva, the ancient Baltic religious association, asked to be registered. And initially it was approved, but then a letter from the Lithuanian Bishops' Conference was sent to the government. And as a result of this, Romuva was denied registration. The Catholic bishops said that it wasn't really the ancient Baltic religion that it had claimed to be, and that it was very divisive. The Russians had supported it during the Soviet time, and they likened it to sort of KGB and things for which there wasn't really any proof whatsoever. The European Court said that the government, the Seimas, had been unreasonable, and they weren't objective objections, they weren't neutral and impartial. The Catholic Church shouldn't be interfering with this at all, and they should grant state recognition. And then if we turn to Estonia, another pagan group or group of pagans, the House of Tara and native religions, wanted to protest to the European Court. Sorry, no, they didn't reach the point is they didn't go to the European Court. What had happened was in 1996, New Churches and Congregation Act was drafted, and it needed terms such as congregation or association of congregations or church to be part of the registering language. And the pagans complained that their religious freedom was being violated this way, and they'd be liquidated because they couldn't define or register themselves using terms of another religious tradition. And eventually in 2004, an amendment to the Act allowed the religious associations to use their own terms for registration. So they could use terms like Grove in their official names. So that was different.
Sorry, Elaine, for interrupting me.
Have I used my 20 minutes?
Yeah, time is running close to...
How long have I got?
25 minutes. And we want to we want to give also Alessandro Ferrari a fair chance to present his. So you have another 3 minutes for a conclusion.
Okay. Observatories are being set up. Some of these are government operated, like Mivilude in France. There are other ones which aren't connected, but the government might use. Mivilude is set up to, it stands for Interministerial Mission of Vigilance and Fighting Against Sectarian Aberrations. And this is Scientologists protesting. And then governments can label, and they do label. The China constitution says freedom as long as you're just a normal religion. But if you're defined as Sijal, this originally means heterodox organizations, but it's now translated as evil cults, religions like Falun Gong, and they're imprisoned in thousands, tens of thousands, and there's evidence that organ harvesting has been carried out. Church of Almighty God is the #1 now. I've been reprimanded in Beijing in a lecture for calling Falun Gong a new religious movement, because the government says it isn't religious, because if it were religious, it'd be protected by the law. And Russia, as the chair mentioned, has introduced the category of extremism for literature. And the extremism law says that any organization that's got literature on the list of extremist materials is to be banned, and its participants are deemed to have performed a criminal act. And Jehovah's Witnesses are the ones that are most affected, but there are other movements. And it's funny that they should be called, and the only thing they are extremist pacifists, and they've died for that. Other examples of labeling as a non-religion have occurred on various occasions. In America, this man, Lieutenant Governor, said you can even argue whether Muslim is actually a religion or a nationality or a cult, whatever you like to call it, when he was discussing about whether Muslims had right to protection by the First Amendment. France, the Abu Pikar law is focused on minority religions, the sects, and it introduces a whole lot of ways of making their practices illegal and criminal. Sometimes the state is violent, like the FBI attacking the Branch Davidians, or the Philadelphia police dropping a bomb on the move, or the organ harvesting. The after states, I'm just showing here how it isn't always as straightforward as it might seem, or sometimes religions are privileged. Religions themselves react in certain ways to the law, which I've mentioned briefly here in a whole lot of different ways. There's a book that Jim Richardson and I have edited, which give far more information about that. Two final points. There's no necessary correlation between legal and social constraints or encouragement. In China, there are high legal constraints, but it's moderately few social hostilities that you find. Whereas in India, there's high social hostility and relatively low legal constraints. And also lack of state or legal intervention can lead to problems, because then the people will take it into their own hands to do the discrimination. Civil lawsuits, vigilante groups, or deprogramming in America and Europe. So concluding remarks, different states respond in different ways. There is discrimination against minority religions, and it's increasing. They respond in different ways. Before and after states are ideal types. There are continuants, so France is at the after end of the before states or the before end of the after states. There's differences within and between both the religions and the states and the laws, different applications. And so ideal types can't be judged as being more or less true, but only more or less useful. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, Elaine, for this very fascinating tour d'horizon through legal systems according to your ideal types of before state and after states, and all these examples of the discriminatory behavior either by law or in the application of law, that means in practice, against the religious minorities. And due to our time constraints, so I think we can expand our panel until 11 o'clock, so that Alessandro has really a fair chance also to use his 20 minutes for the presentation. But I see a very, very interesting connection now with regard to his topic, what does the will unveil? And in this regard, I'm very interested to see his analysis of the case law also of the European Court of Human Rights, which you mentioned several times. And in one of his papers, he coined the phrase, which I found very interesting, that, well, the Western European system in particular is an inclusive double standard secularism, which I think neatly follows up with your argument that after states are not always that straightforward in the effective protection of religious minorities. And Alessandro is a professor, full professor at the Department of Law, Economy and Cultures at the University of Insubria. And his research includes law and religion in Europe, and particularly the legal status of Islam in Europe. Alessandro, thank you for joining us, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Joseph. I would also to thank Eileen and Christina, because they have already spoken so much about law, and so it made me easier in some way to introduce my conversation. What I would like to do now is to try to observe what is the direction in which the right to religious freedom, I'm a legal scholar, in the continental European context is going, and taking into account two preliminary remarks. First of all, Europe, continental Europe, has to be seen as an exceptional case, not only in the way of Grace David, but also in the legal terms, because Europe is where state, church, and individuals, the three pillars of the right to religious freedom, has been born, and from which they have been globalized through different ways. The second observation, introductory remarks, is that I will try to observe these dynamics of the right to religious freedom in Europe following the Muslim veil. I think that headscarf is an interesting case because it offers the possibility to follow the shift from a modern separatist-oriented right to religious freedom from a human rights contemporary oriented right to religious freedom, and also it offers the possibility to enlarge our vision from continental Europe to a larger Mediterranean scale, because also this is an important shift. So in this presentation, I'd like to focus on 4 points. The first is to try to sketch what are the main foundative character of the right to religious freedom in continental Europe. Second, to describe how this model is not functioning toward Islam. Third, to try to understand how Mediterranean regard can help us to offer a wider vision of what is happening in relation to the legal field of religion. And fourth, to draft some scenarios about a contemporary right to religious freedom. So first of all, the roots of the European right to religious freedom are very connected with a word that we have already listened this morning, is the word separation. Europe is a continent that make borders, we know, dramatically, and separation has embodied a sort of Weberian rationality, the clarity of separation to separate not only territory, but also different legal systems. And we know that separation has had, in the history of the right to religious freedom, a main goal. The goal was to ensure the primacy of state legal system in relation to other legal system by granting individuals their freedom of conscience. Separation is really connected to the passage from the old canonical forum internum to the right to freedom of conscience. This freedom of conscience was protected by the state, and this protection was at the basis of the specific and primary link between state and individual, between state and citizen. And this link justifies the supremacy of the nation state toward churches. But separation means also another thing that maybe legal system try to hide. There is another separation, not only between state and church, but also between state, church, and religion. Because we have to remind that churches has played a very important role in the shaping of the European right to religious freedom. Churches play as a scapegoat of the bad confessional religion, as the space where the confessional religion could be shaped and controlled, a sort of scapegoat in relation to the irrationality of confessional religion. And churches has also played the role of hermeneutical institution that had the duty to ensure the state about the legitimacy of individual religious practices. So modern European state didn't define religion, but defines very well what churches were. So this role of churches, both as scapegoat as hermeneutical institution, play a fundative role for our questions. And this role of churches is also connected to the big transformation of religion in modern time, from what Cantor Smith called as practice religion to a belief religion, religion as an opinion, as the Article 10 of the famous Declaration on 1789 of Human Rights call. And so we are in face of a separation that is very different from the American one, where we the people play a so important role and where we have not neither state nor churches. European separation is a very institutional one, where individuals are shaped in boxes very precise, the churches and the state. In exchange of their domestication, European churches had the privilege not to be privatized. No continental law, neither the France law privatized churches. So we have always differentiated law, differentiated regulations for churches that accepted to be shaped by this system. And at the same time, the separation between church and religion, between state, church, and religion, helped state to use religious resources, both confessional religious resources, but also non-confessional religious resources. And this situation is very well, I think, defined by a French constitutionalist, Maurice Oriou, who in 1919 spoke about the fiction of legal ignorance as a sort of the summary of the European model, the French model, but the European model, we can say, of European separation. At the same time, separation is also an interesting ideotype, because around this name, we are different kind of interpretation, narrative interpretation, legal interpretation, and there is a struggle between external and internal legal culture. So we have a separation of philosophical separation, another kind of separation, and so there is a struggle around what is the authentical interpretation of this word. So this model is really founded on state, on churches, and on this fiction of legal ignorance by the modern European state. But this system is not working with Islam. Why is not working with Islam? Islam has never known a church as a scapegoat, in the sense that in colonial time, for example, Muslims, individuals, had always had to take on their shoulder the weight of their bad religion, irrational. And so it has produced also a risk of racialization, of the Muslim question. And then Muslims, differently than Jewish, arrive in Europe in a different time. Jewish were compensated by the loss of their nation because they were transformed in church, in a sort of church that granted individual practices and also could defend them from a too strong secularization. That was the Napoleonian idea about the French consistory. But when Muslims became a European religion, nation state had already defeated legal pluralism, nation state had already formally granted human rights, and so they have nothing in exchange formally to be shaped in church. But the other thing is that they arrived not at the time of separation, but at the time of human right, where at the center is not the simple citizen, but a global citizen that has rights that are not protected only by the nation state, but by a multi-level system of protection. And this change deeply the role of right to religious freedom, where individuals don't need anymore to justify their practice be connecting to a church. They can claim an immediate relevance of their religious practices that are translated into human right languages. And so we are facing a production of new form of public rationalities. And all these challenge the fiction of legal ignorance that is on the basis of European system. And if in the 19th century, Islam could be seen by many European intellectuals as the religion of the future, because it was the religion without church, today we see that the reaction is not really against church, but against individuals themselves. The veil is too an ostensible reference and a too visible reference to human rights beyond nations' borders, is to link with Islam. And so this recalls us the difficulty to mediate between Islam and the old European separation. We know what is the history of colonial veils. We know also what is the history of the law of separation in Algeria that was never implemented, because the idea on one hand was that Islam was not ready for separation, but the substance was that we can't have any Algerian church without an Algerian state. And this put very together the human right of religious freedom with its political impact and role. So when we face veils in Europe, we see also that the question is that we have not Islam in the present constitutional state building, and Muslim women can't call the help of a cultural European heritage. They have no churches, and so they are very often forcibly assigned to interpretation that presume what they think, but they really not listen them, and European cases are full of this. Because church today is still very operational and very important for European rights to religious freedom, and Elina has already spoken about the different system of registration, for example. Why church is today so important? Because church and institutional church try to ensure a safe space against dangerous balances among competitive rights in a secular society. They try to offer a specific space where religion can try to resist in front a balance to the right, above all the right connected to sexuality, that in the general balance are much more strong than religion itself, and church offer a sort of last bastion, a last wall against this kind of balance. But the veil is not connected to a church, and so can be interpreted as a political sign, a discriminatory sign, no religious exemption. And the other role that churches play today is to be recipients for promotional and differential rights that are discretionary offered by the state in exchange of loyalty. And so we are now a sort of reward secularism more than a positive secularism, because we are passing from the idea of difference to the need of homogeneity and loyalty versus legality and an osmosis between different legal systems. And this also is a sort of hypertrophy of the fiction of legal ignorance, where in some way the politicization of the public space that has been promoted by human rights is used by a neutrality that depoliticizes this same space that has become political thanks to human rights. And this is producing a sort of invisibility of religious difference that has not been shaped by modernity. So we have an attempt of all the instruments of modernity to kidnap what are the novelty of constitutionalism in relation to religious freedom. And this dynamics is possible also to see in the larger Mediterranean scale. And I think that this is very interesting from a different point of view. Because on one side, to look at the Mediterranean offer us the possibility to follow the history of two opposite fiction, the fiction of legal ignorance of religion in the northern side, and the fiction of legal recognition of religion in the southern shore. And these two fictions are working in a sort of different chronology, because Europe arrived at modern state in some point. We know the ideal type of Westphalia. The southern shore know Westphalia at the decolonizing time, so very, very late. But when southern shore discovered the strength of the state, the authoritarian state, Europe is entering in the post-constitution, in the constitutional phase, and the constitutional phase arriving in Southern Shore constitutionalism after the post so-called Arab Spring. So this pendulum that now is fixed in line with human rights, new different timing, and we can observe how today the Northern Shore and the Southern Shore are facing Islam in a very parallel way. In the Northern Shore, against the veil or niqab and burqa, we used to quote religious authorities from the South, really intellectual from the South, justify at the international level the European ban. At the same time, in the South, we have human rights used against government, but we have also European jurisprudence that is used by government against a protester and against democratic force. For example, yesterday, Algeria used an Austrian case, the ES against Austria, in front of the Strasbourg court in 2018 for justifying the sentence against the 3 years of jail against an intellectual that offended Islam. So there is this interplay in this time where modern state is trying to defend themselves from these changes, and also from the so-called terrorism, religious oriented. And this is helping also to find a way to establish churches in Islamic wars, because in this case, we need religious authority that can justify good religious practices against bad religious practices in Islam war too. And that interreligious dialogue is very interesting in this church building. For example, the document signed in Abu Dhabi by Pope Francis and the Sheikh of Al-Azhar is very interesting in this process of church building at the Mediterranean scale. So what can be this right to religious freedom in a sort of contemporary time and in the constitutional time? I think that as has already been said, I think by Christina, we are in a moment, in a period where it's very clear a mutual interiorization of the discourse of human rights, both from religions and state orders, is an interiorization that can be very instrumental, but is inevitable, is and if you look at the documents that are producing in the Islamic world, this is very interesting. So we have a porosity of borders and the role of individual autonomy that is very much important to pass from looking for rational religions to relational religion. And the main question is also to free a constitutional principle from old category. For example, should be very much important to free constitutional laïcité from separation. Laïcité was constitutionalized only in 1946 with a very important role of religions, MRP, a Catholic movement, Catholic Church, the first declaration 1946 of Conference of Bishops. And this role of religion in shaping laïcité that was constitutionalized instead of separation, because the debate were what we are constitutionalizing, separation or laïcité, today is completely forgotten. And this fact has prevented constitutional laïcité, constitutional secularism, to effectively play its role of grantor of pluralism. That was what we can find in the constitutional debate when we read the debate at this assembly. And if we speak about pluralism, we can't avoid also the word of reasonable accommodation. It's quite obvious what I'm saying, but also the role of reasonable accommodation, and so the balance between freedom and equality will be at the center of the future right to religious freedom. And we already seen the jurisprudence of Luxembourg Court that try to go in this direction. We have obviously the constitutionalization of the marriage of appreciation by the Protocol of Brighton. But if we look at how Luxembourg Court play when he speak to Germany, he can say something more because Germany is more open to accommodation, and when he speak to Germany, can use an openness to speak also to France. When he speak directly to France, he can have a more mediate tune, but when we took together all elements, help us to go toward pluralism. Other point is in the contemporary right to religious freedom. I think that we are also to soften some words that we use in the past, like legal pluralism or also religious minority, in the sense that more than legal pluralism that is so connected with border and separation, we should emphasize more the role of complex systems, more the role of porosity, or more of the role of non-institutional individuals. And the role of religious minorities, I think, is interesting, not because it helps to ensure more equality, so a sort of more dimension of positive equality, but is used is important because it's a sort of shortcut for religions that has not churches, because many of these positive dimension of equality is connected with church. If you use a religious minority, we can try to use this without having an institutional churches. So this is, I think, the role in our European right to religious freedom. Other thing is the need to have a right to religious freedom more connected to association than to institution, more local to national, more able so to catch the vaporization of religion and its institutionalization. Fourth is also the attention to make the distinction between atheism and confessional religions. This is a delicate point because the transformation into religion of atheist movements is interesting because help us to have a new approach to nouns or to a form of secularism, to be more attentive when we speak about secularism, but is also important to avoid to lose the distinction between confessional religions and non-confessional religion, to avoid also a neutralization of public space and overlapping between neutrality and negative religion. So just at the end, to finish, what we can say that state and church are still there, but in a sort of Lavoisierian turn. They are transforming, and so, but they are still there in a more global and transnational issue, that separation is still there, but much more mobile, and a sort of space where individuals can communicate and can move simultaneously among borders. And so I think also, and I finish here, the role of constitutionalism is still to be discovered. I think that what we are lacking now is not the law, as is already been said, but an external legal culture. Here I'm a little Bokenfordian to sustain this constitutionalism, because I think that this constitutionalism has so far been interpreted too much as a modern concept than a contemporary concept. And I will stop here.
Thank you so much, Alessandro, for this, again, fascinating tour d'horizon through the concepts of religious freedom with regard to models of separation on the one hand, and pluralism is, if I might summarize that, on the other hand. And I think the topic and the concept of pluralism was one of the three major issues in all of the three presentations we heard this morning. So we have still some time, let's say 10 minutes left for discussion. And I'm wondering who is again willing to break the ice. Maybe Mr. Pirna is ready to do that, or somebody else from the participants. Could you raise your hand so that I can? Yeah, Mr. Pirna, please, you have the floor.
Yes, thank you. As you inspired me to to break the ice, I will do that. It is an interesting talk you have given, and I would like to ask you on your understanding of human rights. You used the human rights references several times, concentrated on the right to religious freedom. And I wonder how you would estimate the discourse, the present human rights discourse, on how pluralistic the understanding of human rights can and should be. So we have, as in my observation, we have on the one hand side a couple of scholars and a couple of movements who would advocate more secular understanding of human rights, and making the point that religion is part of the problem and not part of the solution. And on the other hand, you might say you have the people that I would call people who have a pluralistic understanding of human rights, that is open to different interpretations by different religions and by different worldviews, and who would also make the point that religions and worldviews are a part of the solution and are contributing to human rights. So I wonder how you perceive the overall situation, and maybe especially from your context of these two positions. How would you say how they relate to each other, or which one is the stronger one?
Thank you. To be honest, I not look at human rights in a such a dialectic perspective. Maybe I wrong in the sense that when I think to religion, I see confessional religion, non-confessional religion. I perceive religion as something that is very well under legal system, is everywhere in some way. And so confessional religion shaped by churches is just an expression of this religion. And so is an expression very much established also by the state. So human rights in the right to religious freedom give individuals agency in a new meaning, because in constitutional order of post-Second World War, at least in Europe, legitimacy of the state is justified only in function to the guarantee of these human rights. And so individuals are the real, more than religion, the real problem from the present modern state. And in this situation where are individuals, there is also the fact that these individuals are not only citizens, are not only the people that participate in the public debate and make law, but are also foreigners from the nation state. So people that don't participate to the establishment of the common rules that they have to follow at the national state level, that is the first level in the multi-level system of protection where they are involved. So I think that the human rights is a real challenge, but not because it provokes a sort of religious and non-religious, secular and religious clash, but because give legitimacy in the first order to all kind of claims. And this is the problem that laws can't resolve, and I have no answer, sorry, but the problem is how you can transform this political relevance that is given to individuals' claim, because whole individuals can use human rights. We have not the possibility to close the interpretation of human rights. And this is the strength of human rights that are used by religions and non-religion. This is the challenge of the present osmosis among legal order. What I say are two connected problems. One is how help is too paternalistic. So how try that individuals participate in the political debate for the construction of laws, and the second is how we can make that state maintain a self-restraint in relation to a public space that is became public thanks to the human rights. But this does not mean that this public space is a state public space. So is how we can keep osmosis and how can avoid homogeneity. This is the challenge. But the clash that we find in this, we have, I think that we have neo-Salafism. We have a religious Salafism, but we have also a modernist Salafism. There is a reaction of the state of modernity toward this so complicated legal world, and we are in a time of multiple Salafisms, and their role is just to try to do how to cope this, but I have no resources to help in this. So this is just what I see. And what I can see is that the role of legal cases and jurisprudence and this reasonable accommodation that are so diabolized in some context was also too much, I would say, emphasized, but is what can be a contemporary way to cope with differences. But knowing that the tension and conflict, as we know, are something that we have to be used to have. But sorry, I have no answer to you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I would like to raise, of course, the provocative question to both Eileen and Christina in the end. When we speak about human rights, isn't that Eurocentric concept, which is not accepted all around the globe, for instance, not in the Russian Federation, saying, well, this is exactly the point here from the perspective of the Russian Orthodox Church, to say, well, liberalism and liberal human rights is not the same thing, what we understand as possible freedom of religion and freedom of conscience. So is this also a debate and a contest, a normative contestation about the meaning of human rights? And of course, the same question to Eileen in the end. If there is a state and there is law of the state in which people live together, is the need for registration, already a discrimination by the state in itself, a violation of the human right to religious freedom, that you ask for certain criteria for official registration, so that you have not only freedom but also some limitations of the freedoms, as we know it from all the limitations in the legal documents you have explained to us. I don't know who wants to start first. Christina, please.
Okay, I wanted to have Eileen go first. No, I mean, of course, it's all about the contestation of human rights. And I think the only question that, at least for sociologists of religion or sociologists of law or lawyers interested in sociology, is how people do that, how they contest. And I think what is interesting is that the Russian Orthodox Church has started to contest human rights in the language of human rights. And they could have done otherwise, because they could also have said, we don't use human rights because they are the product of a civilization, Western Enlightenment civilization, that we don't belong to, that we don't share. And that's why we have our own, our own rights or our own notions of that. And they are using the language of human rights, the human rights instruments. They are referring to, Universal Declaration. They are referring to the European Court. So this is interesting. I think this is what we can study. And of course, it's about contestation of what we mean by it.
Okay. Aline, please. Is registration already a discrimination?
Yes.
Discrimination?
It can, of course, give privileges. And sometimes you can think that it's discrimination against the non-religious. If you think of RIFRA, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, and some of the ways that has been used. The let-out clauses that people claim religious freedom, they say, oh, and sometimes this may be seen to be the legitimate, like Seventh-day Adventists not being made to work on a Saturday, a whole lot of other things. Sikhs not having to wear helmets, and sometimes this is sort of sensible, but it isn't universal laws. And I think another important distinction is whether you think, or the politics is that the group or the sort of reified whole is more important than the individuals, which is certainly the rhetoric you get in Russia, and even more so in China. Russia, they all, however, have these things in their constitution, pretty well all, about human rights or religious freedom and belief, including atheistic beliefs or humanism. So it's a big muddle, but there definitely is a difference between the countries which look more at the individual in their justifications for the individual human rights, and the one that says for the good of the community as a whole. And you can get that in your vaccination things as well, all sorts of different ways in which this is manifest.
Okay, thank you so much for this very interesting morning session on religion, state, and law under the overall concept, the umbrella concept of secularization and the trends of either desecularization or post-secularity, as you would like it, from different theoretical perspectives. So as far as I can see, we have some 5 minutes left for the so-called coffee break before we go on with the second panel. And I'm happy also to see Ulrike Bechmann, who will chair the second panel here in front of me on the screen. And having said that, thank you so much again also to our participants on the stream. We are still followed by 64 people on the stream from all over the world, as far as I can see. Without any further ado, Thank you so much again. And Ulrike Pechmann will start the second panel in 5 minutes, as far as I can see.
So we start the second panel, and a warm welcome, first of all, from me. My name is Ulrike Pechmann, and I'm a professor at University of Graz for religious study. I have the honor to moderating this panel, and a warm welcome now to our contributors, Professor Modud and Dr. Limacher. Unfortunately, first of all, I have to say that Professor Lolka had to cancel his lecture today due to health issues. And it was only yesterday that he felt that he is not possible to do that. So for this panel, we have two persons here, two lectures. And we start according to our schedule on this panel on multiculturalism and fundamentalism with the then now first but second lecturer, Professor Modud from the University of Bristol. Professor Modud, heartily welcome also from my side, and I think from all panelists. Multiculturalism and fundamentalism is, I think, not to introduce to anybody who is part of this conference, and that there are important factors on the issue of religion, state, and law, and especially on the sociology of the states. And we have heard about fights or about positions of different contributors of the society, of the Orthodox Church and others. So now I think we put the focus on this part. And before your lecture starts, Professor Modud, I have the honor to introduce you shortly. Professor Modud is Professor of Sociology, Politics and Public Policy at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at the University of Bristol. He is Fellow of the British Academy. Born in Pakistan, he moved to Britain and works since 1997, as far as I see, as a professor there. It's a long time, Professor Modud. You have been working as a professor in Bristol. And looking at your homepage, you hold so many activities, publications, and honors that it is impossible to introduce you shortly. So I strongly recommend to everybody to look at his website to get the full picture of Professor Modud's academic career. You are also the founding director of the Bristol University Research Center for the Study of Ethnicity and Citizenship, and co-founding editor of the international journal Ethnicities. So among the impressive list of publications which are dealing with subjects of theory and politics of racism, racial equality, ethnic identities, multiculturalism, secularism, and especially also for British Asian Muslims. I just name your last book, and I think that brings us to the topic that is now presented by you. Your last book, 2019, is Essays on Secularism and Multiculturalism. So this brings us directly to your lecture about multiculturalizing secularism, and the floor is yours. Please, Professor Modud.
Thank you very much, Professor Beckmann. And hello, everybody. Good morning. Very pleased to be here. I must just offer a short apology, which I hope what I fear may happen doesn't happen. And that is my university is on strike today. So I'm doing this Zoom presentation from home, and around me is my family and my dog. And I don't have a private study, so they may walk in and out and make noises and so on. So please bear with me. I hope not. I've told them not to, but you know what family's like. So I've got a few slides, so I'll share the screen. Right, let's get to the top here. That's my university and my center. Here's the title. Well, actually, Multiculturalizing Secularism is the title. So if we're talking about multiculturalizing secularism, and why we might talk about that is because we might be committed to multiculturalism, and we might be committed to some version of political secularism. So the question then arises, what do these two commitments mean if they're to be held in combination? And so the term multiculturalizing secularism is a way of describing, at least normatively and politically, what that might mean. So first, we must have some idea of what we think secularism is, political secularism. I'm not talking about secularism in any other sense. I'm not talking about what, for instance, sociologists call secularization in relation to personal life, family life, social structures, and so on. And I'm certainly not talking about any kind of metaphysical secularism like atheism, agnosticism, and whether there is life after death or anything like that. Just the whole thing is really just political. So we have to have a view on what is political secularism. And you will know that is not an easy matter because, of course, there's quite a lot of controversy. There always is about any ism, and there certainly is about secularism. And what is interesting is that as the topic has become more salient in the last sort of decade, 15 years, and so on, quite a few leading authors have begun to change their positions on what it is. Perhaps the two most famous revisions come from John Rawls and Jürgen Habermas, both of whom moved away from their earlier views about political secularism. But I'm not going to discuss them here. There isn't time, and you may already be familiar with their positions. But I will talk about other authors who actually are not as famous as those two, though they are quite eminent, and who also have shifted their positions. But I'm not really interested in other people's positions so much as explaining my own and explaining what I believe to be true, to be the case. So political secularism. I begin not so much, not initially anyway, with a definition or a theory, but I say to myself, well, what might we call a secular state, a secular political system? And of course, we have lots of examples in the world, but I take just two, certainly for this presentation, just two, and say, if we are to have a definition of secularism or a starting point for thinking about secularism, it must surely cover two very well-known cases. And as you can see from my slide, my two cases are the United States of America and the USSR. Now, I don't know whether everyone will agree, but it seems to me that those two are self-evident secular states. If those two, or even one of them, was to be said to be not a secular state, then I don't know what we'd be talking about when we're talking about political secularism, because I think these two are exemplary secular states. And so we need a definition of political secularism that equally covers both of those two states, and of course all the other examples, but here are two extreme and prominent examples. And you can see in blue my minimal definition. So political secularism is politics or the state has a raison d'etre of its own and should not be subordinated to religious authority, religious purposes, or religious reasons. So basically, my definition of political secularism is a form of political autonomy. Politics having some autonomy from religious authority. Now, I'm not saying this covers the full extent of what political secularism can mean or does mean in practice. That's not my point. My point is that this is the minimum definition that covers all cases, more than this. It can't be less than this. That's my point. It can be more than this. So the autonomy of politics can be expanded into what we might call a mutual autonomy. So not only is the state autonomous from religious authority, but religious authority is autonomous from the state or political authority. That's what I mean by mutual autonomy, as I'm sure you understand. And many states that we would call liberal democratic secular states have this at their core. And that's good and that's fine. I'm not denying that. My point is simply that they have this because they are liberal democratic states, not simply because they're secular states, because the USSR was a secular state, or the People's Republic of China is a secular state, and it doesn't have mutual autonomy. So secularism must be, as it were, less than mutual autonomy. So political secularism can be connected to other isms. It can be connected to liberalism, to nationalism, republicanism, as in laïcité, and or various historical and country contexts, because different countries can have different institutional configurations based on their history and based on their own interpretations, not just of what is secular, but their own interpretations of the idea of liberty, equality, democracy, constitutional law, and so on. And if that's the case, then of course, political secularism isn't a description of a singular phenomenon. We should talk about multiple secularisms. And the two things that I'm trying to connect together are, of course, political secularism and multiculturalism. Those are the two isms I'm working with, but I'm not just working with them in the abstract or in general. I'm working with them, as you will see in a moment, very much in relation to one particular kind of political secularism. So to get to that, let me distinguish some key forms of political secularism. And this is, in a way, fairly obvious stuff that I'm sure you're all very familiar with, at least numbers 1 and 2. So political theorists have long distinguished between what they call liberal secularism of the United States, which is based on the idea of freedom of religion and the absolute separation of church and state. And they've distinguished that from laïcité, or what we could call republican secularism, where we have the key idea of which is one-sided control. Of course, it's more than that. I'm not saying it's just that. It also has a conception of freedom of religion within it, but it's a freedom of religion within one-sided control. So it's unlike the US, where there is supposed to be mutual autonomy in full. the laicite says some mutual autonomy, but as long as the state is in charge, one-sided control. This political secularism I'm interested in multiculturalizing is actually a third version. And I introduced that by adding a plus sign. I say +3, because actually, till very recently, it wasn't even acknowledged as being a form of political secularism or a family of political secularisms. Not by political theorists and public intellectuals. They just talked about two forms, which I've mentioned, the first two forms. But when I came to the subject, and I came to it very much from the direction of multiculturalism and the inclusion of religious minorities like Muslims in Western Europe, the first thing I noticed is the political secularism that we have in Britain and the Netherlands and Belgium and Germany and the Nordic countries actually is neither one, two. And yet we are secular states. We profess to be, and certainly by my definition, we are, and I think most people would say that we are secular states. And moreover, the political secularism as an idea and an institutional form originates in these countries, originates in Northwestern Europe. So some people say, oh, well, these states, they say that about Britain all the time. Britain's not really a secular state, they say, because we have an established church with the monarch, our head of state, as the supreme governor of that church, you know, since Henry VIII. But I don't think that makes much sense. The world has changed a lot since Henry VIII. Britain certainly has, and I think we are a secular state. And it's not that we are an imperfect secular state, it's that we are a distinctive secular state, distinctive from 1 and 2. And so to describe this form, the actually existing, historically evolved forms of polities, secular polities of Western Europe, especially Northwestern Europe, I've coined the term moderate secularism to describe them. Other people describe them in different ways, but I think in overlapping and complementary ways. And here we have an emphasis on mutual autonomy and moreover, mutual support. So church and state or religion and politics are not just mutually autonomous, but in some forms or other, they mutually support each other. So let me say a little bit more about this moderate secularism. And I'm sorry if I'm going a little bit slow, but given the absence of the third speaker due to sickness, Lucas said to me, I may take a little bit longer to present. So I hope, Professor Beckman, that message was conveyed to you as well, because otherwise you may think, why am I going so slowly?
Well, we talked about giving you both some more minutes.
Great, perfect. I don't think I'll use all that time, but I will. I am taking my time more than I would have done if I had to stick to 20 minutes. So moderate secularism, the actually existing political secularism to be found in Northwestern Europe in the late 20th, early 21st century. I characterize it by identifying 5 broad features, which take slightly different forms in different countries. I'm not at all committed to the view that they take an identical form. So these are more identifying principles or a political ethic rather than specific institutional forms. So the first point is one I've already mentioned: mutual autonomy, not mutual exclusion like the United States, or one-sided control like laicite. The second point, which of course overlaps with other forms of political secularism, certainly the American and to a large extent French and other forms, is the centrality of freedom of religion, over time expanded to freedom of conscience. The third feature, and this is now more distinctive of moderate secularism, the third feature is that religion is regarded as not just a private matter, not just a private good. So most people will agree that religion can be a private good. Even many atheists say that. For instance, it can be quite good as a form of educating morality for children. For instance, it can be a strength at times of personal grief or even community grief and so on. But people say, well, that's just a private matter. But in moderate secularism, another good is identified, and that is it can be a public good. It may not be, it's not that it necessarily has to be, but for instance, churches may run schools that society can benefit from, and therefore the state should support. And a number, in fact, nearly all members of the European Union either fund church schools or faith schools, or they fund religious instruction in standard state schools. So that's one example of what I mean by religion can be a public good. I won't say more about that unless you ask me under discussion. Two more features. The church, that is to say the organizer of this public good, belongs to the people or the country, not just to its individual members. This is quite a striking feature of Western or European Christianity, of European churches. So in the United States, churches belong to their members, and you can be expelled from a church. Of course, the Catholic churches also, you can be excommunicated, but that's a very rare thing. But in the United States, members pay money into a church, make donations. They look after the church. The church belongs to particular individuals or organizations which are set up like businesses. That's not the case in moderate secularism. The church is a public organization, and even those people who are not members may avail themselves of the use of the church, as so many people do for weddings and funerals and Christmas and Easter and so on. You can pop into any church, you don't have to be a member of it. And you don't even have to say you're a professing Christian. And the last feature is, and this is of course quite a controversial idea, certainly by other people, other forms of secularism like laicite or the United States, it is legitimate for the state to be involved in bringing out the public good element of organized religion. Not just protecting the public good from the dangers that organized religion can pose, but that it is legitimate for the state to support church activity at certain points, for instance, welfare or schools, as I've also mentioned. So I think I've said enough to give you some idea of what I mean by political secularism and moderate secularism, but I've said nothing whatsoever about multiculturalizing this. So let me turn to that now. So here are what I call some pro-diversity approaches. They may or may not call themselves multiculturalist, but they are all pro-diversity approaches. And the first one, Will Kimlicka, perhaps the best known political theorist of multiculturalism, of course, does call himself a multiculturalist. And his view is that multiculturalism is not appropriate for religion or religious diversity. For religious diversity, actually, we should have the US model. We should have state neutrality, which of course he argues against when it comes to linguistic minorities, when it comes to native Canadians, and even when it comes to post-immigration minorities. But he says, when those minorities are ethnic and cultural, but when they are religious, he says, no, the state should keep out. there should be neutralism, no multiculturalism for ethno-religious groups. Now, this is a position that he is actually central to his theory, earlier theory, but he has changed his mind. So he's one of these people that has given up his earlier views about state and religion. So I'm just referring to the views that he held till at least about 2005, and which are part of his famous theory of special rights. A second approach is found in the work of Yolanda Jensen and Cécile Laborde. And Cécile Laborde, of course, emerged in the last few years as a leading political theorist of political secularism on both sides of the Atlantic, certainly, you know, in the Anglophone world. And she says, what the state may do, what politics, laws, and so on may do, is to combat the othering, the prejudicial treatment and the prejudicial representation of religious minorities. People like, say, Jews historically, or perhaps even today, certainly Muslims in Western Europe today, are othered. They're treated as not really us, but some alien living in our presence, living in our political system or on our territory. And that means that they cannot enjoy equal citizenship. Jensen and Laborde argue, and I agree. Therefore, the state has a duty to promote equal citizenship, and so it can combat the othering of Muslims, not the promotion of Muslims, but the equal citizenship of Muslims, simply by fighting the negative presentation of Muslims. The third approach is that of Rajiv Bhargava, and also actually Cécile Laborde took this position in some of her earlier work. I don't think she holds this position now. And that is that religious minorities can become alienated from the ways in which the state favors some other religion or religions, like it may favor the Anglican Church, it may favor Lutheran churches or the Catholic Church. And this can create alienation from society and country on the part of these religious minorities, and the state may act to counter that, because that again is a position not consistent with equal citizenship. So those are three positions. My own position goes beyond them, and I'll explain why by pointing to what I think is central to multiculturalism, and that is that it offers a distinctive extension of our concept of political equality, of citizenship equality. So we're all familiar with the first of these on the slide, which is the right of individuals or minorities to assimilate to the majority, you know, if they want to, or dominant culture in the public sphere, and that there should be liberal toleration of religious difference in the private sphere. So I'll call that liberal equality, liberal citizenship. I don't have any problem with that. Most people don't. But the problem is that it's not enough to combat the inequality that can exist for minorities, including religious minorities. And therefore, multiculturalists over the last quarter century or few decades have extended the concept of equality to cover the right to have one's difference recognized and supported in both the public and the private spheres, not have one's religious identity confined to the private sphere, but the difference, the religious difference has to be accommodated in the public sphere. So that's my understanding of multiculturalist equality. And if that's the case, what then does multicultural secularism mean? And you'll see that here I'm explicitly now going beyond those three diversity approaches that I mentioned a moment ago. Because multicultural citizenship is not just about toleration of minorities. It is about recognition. Recognition means not just the symbolic inclusion of minority identities, of religious minority identities, but also their institutional accommodation. For instance, at schools, making sure that minority faiths requirements are observed at schools, like, for instance, the provision of halal or kosher meat, and of belonging, of making sure that minorities can feel they belong to the state, to the national identity, as much as the historically dominant religion or religions. And this means not merely an anti, but a positive inclusivity. So this is a positive concept of equality, and the state works to include people. It doesn't just work to combat othering, racism, alienation. It works positively as well. There's, of course, a negative side, but there's also the positive actions and policies of inclusion. This is largely, not entirely probably, but largely additive. Minorities are added to the political arrangements of secularism, of moderate secularism, and to the national identity that moderate secularism is part of, the national citizenship that moderate secularism is part of. It's not about subtracting. It's not a matter of saying, oh, Christians have to be dispossessed of something so that Muslims don't feel alienated. No, it's a matter of what can we offer Muslims so that they're not alienated without dispossessing anybody, without subtracting from what we have today. Which means, and this is really my final point, which means that the equality that we're talking about is what I call equalizing upwards, not downwards. So there are many people who call themselves secularists all over Europe and the world, who say, well, yes, of course, religious minorities now, like, you know, Muslims settled in Europe, should have equality with their Christian co-citizens. Of course they should. Christians shouldn't have a privileged position within our states. And so what we will do, as people say about the Anglican establishment, is we will disestablish. We will remove the privileges of Christians. So that's a bit like saying Christians have been here, Muslims are down at the bottom. We'll bring the Christians down to the level of Muslims, and look, now we've got equality. Well, I think that's completely the wrong way to go, and it's certainly not the multiculturalist way to equalize downwards. It's a bit like saying, as my vice-chancellor might say, you know, we have a gender pay gap at Bristol University. Male professors are on average paid more than female professors on average. From next year, we're going to have pay parity. All male professors are going to lose 10% of their salary. I don't think any feminist is calling for that. No one believes that would be the way forward for gender equality. So similarly, why tell religious minorities that their equality will be achieved by dispossessing Christians or someone else? I think that's not the multiculturalist way. So for multiculturalism, it's about some form of equalizing upwards, bringing religious minorities who do have a status of inequality up to a level where they can enjoy equality. This is exactly what we do with all other minorities, like racial minorities, ethnic minorities, sexual minorities, and so on. We create an equalizing upwards. And I think we should do the same for religious minorities, and that moderate secularism but perhaps not laïcité, perhaps not American liberalism allows us to do that. So thank you very much. And I've taken a bit longer because because that time was available to explain my case. But that is now what I mean by multiculturalizing secularism, and I'll stop sharing my slide.
Thank you, Professor Modood. Thank you very much for sharing. And we have some more minutes now, of course, for questions and comments and whatever on this definition of multiculturalism, secularism. Yes.
I have a thought, a question. Can I?
Yes, I don't see. Then, yeah, okay, you start. Then Professor Marco, as I see. I can't see everybody, so yes, please.
Okay, thank you, Professor Modood. I am Henriette Dahan-Kalev from Ben-Gurion University, and I really enjoyed your points, very fascinating and stimulating. I didn't hear clearly because of an audio problem, whether you mentioned at the beginning Rawls, John Rawls, did you? Okay, so I want to go along this line in order to ask you about his chapter on equal liberty, because I think it's very relevant to many of the points that you made. And the point is, how would you relate to his idea of tolerating the intolerant? It's chapter 4 there, he's speaking about tolerating the intolerant. And this is because it is not comparable to the last point you made. That is, it's not a question of money, it's a question of belief. And people are either secular or religious. I think there are differences between the nature of the beliefs in the values of a religious person to a secular person. Of course, we have many, many examples. I don't want to take time, but I want to ask you if you have any thoughts about the Rawls' point of tolerating the intolerance.
Shall I answer that question now?
Yeah, I think directly.
Yeah. Right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your question. So the countries that I'm talking about are already in some form or other liberal democratic states with various forms of entrenched rights of individuals. So I think we want to hold on to those. So you know, if you remember, I said that freedom of religion and freedom of conscience is central to moderate secularism. So I'm not talking about accommodating religions that would run counter to our existing individual rights. And of course, these rights can get extended. So I'm not saying it has to be a static view either, but so I would want to hold on to the importance of individual rights. And the multiculturalist rights, which are what sometimes people refer to as group rights, it's not a satisfactory term, but let's say they're group rights. They are additional to, not a displacement of individual rights. So it's not a matter of, as some people say, that liberalism can only have individual rights, and therefore any notion of group rights is impossible. Here I do agree with people like Will Kimlicka and so on, that liberalism can be adapted and extended to include group rights. And actually, historically, it has. It's only post-Second World War, liberalism, and especially in political theory, Rawlsian versions of liberalism that are so strictly individualist. I suppose the area of controversy that one of the areas of controversy would be around gender. So it's certainly the case that various religious groups, minorities and majorities, can take views on gender and sexuality that the rest of us, you know, society as a whole, might think is discriminatory. It places women in a second-class position. So where these issues go beyond individual rights, I mean, let's say our states both give a right and indeed a duty for all children of both genders or all genders to have to go to school up to a certain age, say 16. So that would be, as I understand it, that would be a compulsion upon religious minorities as well. Now, if they felt that this ran against their individual conscience, as some do, like, you know, the Amish in the United States, I mean, they would have to argue it out within the democratic forum. They should certainly be given a hearing. So the main way that multiculturalists want to resolve value conflicts and controversies is through a dialogical approach, not through liberal legislation only. Of course, there does have to be legislation, and I have talked about entrenched rights, but many controversies will be a matter of dialogue. And I think that's how we would have to try and resolve issues. If say, a minority said, we don't want girls to be taught certain things at school or to engage in certain activities like swimming. I don't think that this is something where we just say, well, actually, you're wrong and we are right, we meaning the liberal state. This is something you have to do. Sometimes we'll have to use the law. I don't have a principle or a set of principles that tells us how we should resolve every dilemma. There will be dilemmas, of course, and there currently are. And the way to resolve them is by trying to understand what is at stake for both sides and trying to see what can be accommodated. Certainly, I would lean towards accommodation as long as individual rights are secured.
Thank you very much. Professor Marco, I have seen your hand.
Yeah, thank you so much. Dear Tariq, in one of your articles published recently in Religions 2021, you also speak not only about multicultural secularism, but also multicultural nationalism in line with multicultural secularism. So, and therefore also the need for a respect of the respective national culture. So does your theory have some sort of a British bias, so to speak? Yeah. When you speak about Great Britain as a model, you have in mind some sort of a laissez-faire multiculturalism, which is of course different from other forms of multiculturalism. So what role does nationalism play in your theory?
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, so I do want to emphasize the importance of national contexts and national citizenships, because I think when we have universal principles, you know, to do with, say, liberty or equality, they take different forms in different locations, and that's fine. That's exactly what one would expect, and I'm not against that. And so I want multiculturalism to run with that kind of interpretive diversity, what Charles Taylor once called polysemic diversity, where our key concepts have slightly different meanings in different places. That does create a problem for me. I certainly readily acknowledge that, especially when I am appalled by some of the things I hear that the French politicians want, or the French state is actually doing right at the moment. You know, it's demand that Muslim organizations sign a particular charter and so on. I mean, this is such a terrible kind of stigmatization of minorities. Why I feel the conflict there is because I think, well, I do want to allow France to resolve its own problems in what you might call a French way. And even, you know, as we all know, the European Court has this freedom, this discretion, margin of discretion. And in particular, it seems to give France a lot of margin of discretion, so that many other member states think that liberal freedoms are being compromised, but the court says, no, that's fine. France can do it. And I too am faced by this difficulty, because I want to allow national discretion. I want national democracies to make their own decisions rather than liberal legislators or liberal political theorists telling everybody what to do. And yet, what if some countries are, if you like, so staunchly anti-multiculturalist? How should a multiculturalist like me respond? So I suppose I kind of respond by trying to have something of each. I kind of want to urge a Republican multiculturalism to emerge and to be a public presence in the arguments and debates taking place in France. And I do hear things. They're very marginal and minority, but people do sometimes say, yes, this is a Republican way of being a multiculturalist or whatever. Certainly when it comes to laïcité, as you're probably aware, over a couple of decades now, some people have developed the idea of an open laïcité. People like Jean Bobero, who he thinks, and he argues that this is actually more historically faithful to French state laïcité, including to the famous law of 1905, which he interprets as much more permissive than has come to be interpreted since the L'Affaire Foulard from 1989 onwards. So he argues that the French state has hardened its laïcité in response to the presence of Muslims, and actually that is a mistake, and it should follow its historic, more liberal laïcité that it evolved in relation to the Catholics and other Christians, and indeed Jews as well.
Okay. Do you have more? Do you need more time? Because we have.
No. So I was just going to sum up in one sentence to say that I do want to emphasize both sides of that, the national way of doing things, but of course I want it to be a multicultural way of doing things. So that's where the phrase national multiculturalism comes from. Thank you, Professor Beckman.
Yeah, Professor Madoud, I have to thank you very much, and I'm sorry to shorten now the discussion, but we have to give the time to Dr. Limacher. And I just put in a comment that was not asked or said no response needed necessarily from the South African context. The one is that religion is welcomed in the public space within the framework of celebrating diversity, but the role of religion is restricted for moral values rather than political mobilization. And the second is that there are good minorities and bad minorities in the eyes of the public and the majority public. Good minorities are Muslims, Hindus, and Jews, which are celebrated. Bad minorities are Pentecostal Christians, which are seen as politically dangerous and irrational. And I put in this comment from the South African context because it brings us to our next speaker, Dr. Katharina Limmacher, and she will talk on fundamentalism, old and new. That may not be exactly Pentecostalism, but in a way, I think it seems to go into the direction, this fundamentalism, old and new, interdenominational alliances in a new Christian right in Austria. And before you start, Dr. Limmacher, I have to shortly introduce you, of course, to the audience. Katharina Limmacher received her PhD in religious studies from the University of Lucerne in Switzerland in 2018, with a thesis on Hindu temple practices in Switzerland and Austria. From 2018 to 2021, she was a postdoctoral researcher at the Research Center Religion and Transformation in Contemporary Societies at the University of Vienna. And I think you are still a member of this research team. And since May 21, you hold the post of a program manager of the newly founded Vienna Doctoral School of Theology and Research on Religion. And you are also part of the research team UB mapping on and offline identifications of urban religious youth situated at the Austrian Academy of Sciences. So your research interests are focused on Europe and especially, I think, Switzerland and Austria. Only one part is the Hinduism in Europe, and one part, as I have seen and your publications, also youth and pop and religion and politics, all these questions that are combined. And now we are looking forward to your presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Thank you for the invitation to give this talk. I will try to share my screen so that you can see my presentation. Okay. Now, do you see it? Is that okay?
It starts, yes.
Yes, it will take some time. It has to buffer sometimes, but it should work.
Yeah, it is there.
Okay, perfect. So as Christina Stecker said in the beginning that her talk slightly changed over the time the conference had been postponed. This is also true for my talk. While I'm still interested in interdenominational alliances and new Christian right, I will look at intra-religious developments today mostly, but I will explain that in the course of my talk. So in my presentation today, I want to show how the analysis of inter-religious protests or dynamics that become public add to our understanding of a new Christian right in Austria, defined as a specific brand of politically engaged Christian fundamentalism. To do that, I will employ the analytic frame of effective publics. Justifiably, one could ask, why am I interested in this particular topic? The short answer is, I am convinced that if we want to understand current developments in a new Christian right in Austria, we need on the one hand to address both intra-religious as well as interdenominational developments on a local as well as on a global level. And we need to take into account how today's network communication technologies demand a different mode of characterizing public articulations of the Christian right. Just as a footnote, because we're all sitting here in lockdown and having fun in our home office in Austria, yesterday, on the occasion of the 1st of December, the Pious Fraternity, who has seen the pandemic as, of course, an apocalyptic struggle between light and darkness, was holding a rosary crusade in the inner city of Vienna. So just to see that the topic I will be talking about has some link to current events or developments. So why should we do that? The slightly longer answer why we should look at these topics is that last year, two colleagues and we published a paper on the development of a new Christian right in Austria, looking at several events and initiatives of the past years that were at least partly interdenominational in character, such as, for example, the 2018 Parliamentary Citizens Initiative Verändern, that attempts to limit women's non-indictable access to abortion, or else the Missionary event Awakening Austria that took place in 2019 in Vienna, where the now ex-chancellor and then aspiring chancellor candidate Sebastian Kurz made a rather bizarre appearance with a public prayer in his name that incited great criticism from both religious and secular sides. So in our paper, we defined the new Christian right as organizations or initiatives that seek political involvement for the implementation of a narrow set of morals and values based, of course, on a fundamentalist interpretation of the Christian religion via a variety of political and or legislative means. Although originating within the Protestant movement, the NCR thereby becomes the conceptual model of certain brands of politically engaged religious fundamentalisms. And this is what we concluded in this paper, that there is, on the one hand, a tendency towards more outspokenness of fundamentalist cultural milieus across Christian traditions in Austria. And on the other hand, that the cases we observed show both the import of US-American revivalism and, of course, its embracement by local actors and the local development of transnational arrangements that foster kind of right-wing ideas by means of religion. So what I want to do is I want to pick up where our paper left off, and I want to complement our findings on interdenominational alliances with a focus on intra-religious developments, while at the same time presenting an analytical framework that helps explain the process of the public emergence of a new Christian right from a more conceptual point of view. I start with a very brief look at Austrian politics, religion relations, considering the current situations, but also two particular historical periods that are important to look at. So, as you all know, Austria is considered a Christian country, more or less. Currently, there are 15 legally acknowledged religious communities in Austria. 12 among them are Christian churches, but also the Jewish and Islamic community are recognized. And even though religious affiliation in general is declining, as we see all over Europe, there is still close to 60% of the whole population, depending on what numbers you use, that still self-identify as Catholic. And an estimated 75% of the population belong to a Christian denomination. So Christian churches, and especially their more politically engaged parts, for example, in the form of welfare organizations, are vocal and visible actors that engage in policy discourses by critically addressing policies of social exclusion, for example. We have already heard today in several of the talks that Austrian religion-state relations in the Western European context have for a long time been described as a cooperative and also inclusive system of shared tasks. So while this is still true, we can see that this inclusive arrangement also has recently come under pressure in some instances at last. This stems primarily from the continuing overlap between politics of religion and the politics of migration, as well as from the increasing politicization of religion as a marker of identity. Thus, certain political as well as religious actors, under the label, for example, of religious nationalism or religious populism, call for the defense of a Christian Europe against an alleged threat of Islamization. This is more or less a very short view on the current situation, but also I would also like to shed light on a rather brief episode of the 20th century, the period of the authoritarian Ständestaat that existed from 1934 to 1938. The short-lived Ständestaat relied heavily on the structures of the Catholic Church, both ideologically, but also in terms of personnel. So, for example, parishes were involved in spreading patriotic ideas and recruiting members for the Vaterländische Front, that was the then newly funded monopolist party. At the same time, the regime under Dollfuss and later Schuschnigg resorted to kind of a liturgical framing and religious legitimization of state ceremonies, like on the occasion of the enactment of the Constitution in 1934. And last but not least, the efforts to make Catholic social teaching a government program were an important aspect of this intertwining between the authoritarian state and the Catholic Church at the time. Of course, a central ideological commonality in the development of a Christian model state and a functioning society was the permission of a traditional image of the family, which was seen as a central factor by representatives both of church and state, and was reflected in several legal changes of the time. For example, in the domain of work or education that increasingly marginalized girls and women. Now, why is this important? I think it is important because the reference to a past in which the faith dominates the national culture remains largely fictional when we look at evangelical fundamentalism of US provenance. In contrast, non-fictional points of reference can be identified from milieus of the Christian right in the Catholic Church in Austria, where Catholic Christian principles combined with state structures form the defining hegemonic culture, if only, of course, for a very short time. This brings me to the third period of interest, which is kind of a look even further back in time. This is the period of ecclesiastical anti-modernism within the Catholic Church itself. So this period is, of course, likely to be much more formative for the self-understanding of today's actors of a new Christian right of Catholic provenance than the events between 1934 and 1938. Fundamentalist currents within the Catholic Church can be characterized by their selective reference to an era of ecclesiastical anti-modernism of the pontificates of Pius IX to Pius XII between 1846 and 1958. Especially after the processes of opening and pluralization that was initiated subsequently by the Second Vatican Council, certain groups and milieus formed within the Catholic Church, which decidedly opposed these changes and wished for an anti-modernist era to return. This anti-modernism included, of course, the rejection of views that characterized contemporary liberal democratic societies, such as, for example, the right to freedom of religion or the separation of church and state. Consequently, as scholar Sonja Struve points out, parallels in terms of both content and time can be discerned for the anti-modernist era within the Catholic Church and the emergence of Protestant fundamentalism in the United States, even if the different religious contents and the context of its emergence must, of course, be kept in mind when we talk about these different forms of emerging fundamentalisms. This is a very brief and, of course, very selective account, and it aims to highlight mainly two aspects. While the contemporary relation of politics and religion in Austria is generally characterized as cooperative, there were historical periods, both in Austria, but also more generally within the Catholic Church, in which political religion formulated core concerns similar to those represented by a new Christian right today. So how can we understand the formation of events, of initiatives or movements that make up what we call a new Christian right in this setting, that is shaped both, of course, by historical events and continuities, but also by contemporary developments? So, this is where I come to introduce my analytic frame of effective publics. I suggest to employ a framework of effective publics and to give a short example of how to apply it to a recent development within the Catholic Church on the occasion of the Amazonian Synod in 2019. Affects and emotions are the starting point from which our media scholar Sisi Papakarisi develops her analytic frame of effective publics. It is mostly queer feminists research of recent years that has done much to understand facts, feelings, and emotions as part of the social and the political. Not only election campaigns or strengthen populisms, but also the New Christian Right make use of the opportunity to create some sort of connectedness and thus political solidarity through affect. Effective public then are networked public formations that are mobilized and connected or disconnected through expression of sentiment. And very central to the emergence of these formations is what Papa Carisi, following Dana Boyd and others, calls networked technologies. So effective publics are publics that have been transformed by network technologies. They are at the same time a space for the interplay of, on the one hand, interactions, technology, and practices, and on the other hand, for the imagined collective that emerges from these interactions. So put simply, if we look at effects and network technologies, we see the emergence of a specific form of a public sphere. According to Papa Carisi, the characteristics of effective publics include the following aspects. Effective publics leave specific digital traces that can be reconstructed. They support connection, but not necessarily collective action. They come about in and through a constant stream of similar statements that make it easy for the individual to join in. And they typically produce disruptions or interruptions of dominant narratives and present underrepresented points of view. To show how interreligious developments can be analyzed using this framework, let me now turn to my example. This will take some time, but I hope it will work. Because I have some more minutes, I would like to show you the excerpt from one of the videos I'm going to talk about. Otherwise, if I had had less time, I would have left that, but if it works, I will try to show it to you. In October 2019, a shaky cell phone video entitled Pachamama Idols Thrown into the Tiber River appeared on YouTube. In this short clip, without explanation or description, we see Alexander Chugul, a young Austrian Catholic and well-known anti-abortion activist. In a protest, he filmed himself and posted online throwing the 5 wooden statues previously kept on a side altar of the Church of Santa Maria in Traspontina into the Tiber River. These wooden statues, so popular representations of a pregnant woman with a visible child in her belly, together with other representations of plants and animals, were part of an ensemble that was displayed in the Vatican Gardens on the occasion of a tree planting ceremony that was led by Catholic clergy and indigenous believers, depicting life in the Amazon. Later, they were taken to that church, and Chugul stole them early one morning in 2019. This is what I'm going to show you. Not the whole video, just a short excerpt, if it works. Can you see it?
Yes.
I think part of it is without sound, so you might be able to hear some sound at some point, but it's not really necessary to understand the images, I think. I think we all get the picture or the idea of it. So the event inscribed itself in tensions that accompanied the Amazonian Synod, and especially the topics discussed therein. While many Catholics associated the Amazonian Synod with hope for change, it was also met with sharp criticism, especially from the ultra-conservative Catholic networks and civil society organizations in the Americas. These included, among others, the TFP, the Society for the Defense of Tradition, Family and Property, founded in Brazil, but also active in the US, and Voice of the Family, a coalition of anti-abortion activists, both organizations that also appear in European networks of organized anti-abortion activism, for example, as solidarity organizations in the context of Agenda Europe. Reactions to the protests were prompt and numerous, especially Catholic media outlets in the US picked up the story and reported on it. In the context of conservative Catholic American media outlets, Chugul was frequently interviewed and celebrated as a hero. But also beyond the Catholic media landscape, the protest caused a stir, which finally culminated in Pope Francis distancing himself from it in an official statement and rejecting the associated accusation of idolatry. Below Chugul's short YouTube clip, which has had more than 220,000 views, a wide variety of commentators expressed their gratitude to Chugul for his courageous action in the name of true Catholic Christianity and used sometimes martial rhetorics. We see here a specific form of transnational activism by religious actors, combining online and offline activism and generating an impressive wave of solidarity. The sharing of the video on YouTube and other social media platforms, the wave of approval in the comments, and the negotiation of the incident and further YouTube videos in which Chugul explains himself, for example, under the hashtag #SplashAmama on Twitter. In short, the sharing of similar content via network technologies is the first criterion by which we can observe the emergence of an effective public in the sense of papacharisy. It leaves various digital traces as a result of the intersection of people, technology, and practices. The participation, that was too fast. The participation that network technologies affirm, for example, through the possibility to share, to comment, gives rise to kind of an imagined collective or imagined community of transnationally connected, genuine Catholics, in distinction, of course, to all other voices within the Catholic Church. And they believe themselves to be at a turning point in the struggle for the future of the Catholic Church, thus corresponding to papacharisy's second and third criteria, the emergence of a connection, as well as a stream of similar statements in which it is easy to participate. The fourth criterion too, the disruption or interruption of dominant narratives, can certainly be considered fulfilled in the case of the protest and its media exploitation. The clear position against a mainstream in the Catholic Church that is perceived as threatening or simply wrong, and the corresponding defensive attitude is only too clearly shown in Chugul's protest, reinforced, of course, by the Pope's official distancing from it. So where does this leave us? I conclude that the framework of effective public provides us with an analytical tool that aptly captures the plural and dynamic processes of groups, initiatives, and networks of a new Christian right becoming publicly visible in Austria, but also across Europe. We've already heard in some presentations about that. There are two aspects in particular that I would like to highlight. So on the one hand, the new Christian right in Austria gains its profile not only by meeting certain ideological or operational defining criteria, like the belief to be part of a besieged minority or organizing in event-based interdenominational networks, but also in an ongoing interrelation between arguments and emotion and process of public contention that are intra-religious as much as interdenominational. The focus on digital network communication technology makes it possible to juxtapose idealized concepts of, for example, deliberative or rationality-based concepts of the public sphere with an understanding of other forms of public articulation or formation. Here, it is especially the dynamics of protest, as we see in the example of Chugul, that makes various forms of translocal public articulation comprehensible, which would elude a conventional concept of deliberation in public sphere. Thus, if we examine the role of politically engaged Christian fundamentalism, this might also prove fruitful for an adjusted understanding of the relationship between religion and the public sphere in general. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Limacher, for this interesting presentation. And we have some time, 10 minutes at least, for discussion. So I open the floor for discussion. Please. Because I don't, yeah. Christina Stöckel.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I raised my hand. So Katharina, I really liked the presentation. I think the concept of effective publics works really well. I'm happy I found that concept. It's interesting that it's also, as you said, a concept that comes from the gender studies, but that can be very well applied also to moral conservative mobilization. And remember in my presentation when I showed the Citizen Go website, that's a very good example of how that works actually. Yeah. So in case you haven't looked at it yet, I think you should, because it would be a perfect example. Now, one question I have, your case study now was very much about Catholic fundamentalism, or sort of ultra-Catholics. There are different words for it. In Italian, they call them integralisti. So there are different words for it. And a scholar from Verona has recently published a book who speaks about neo-Catholics. Mm-hmm. But still, it's within the Catholic Church, and it's very much couched within a split inside the Catholic Church over and against Pope Francis. But the term Christian right, of course, is broader. It implies that there are these transnational interdenominational connections. So I wanted to ask a bit more, in reaction to that particular case study, were there reactions from other Christian religions? Did you find those? Or if not in that case study, what other things did you study, maybe in that article of 2020, where you saw that interdenominational links?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you very much for these questions and remarks. Just a quick remark, effective publics, it's more linked, I mean, the idea of different publics stems from queer feminist research, but the concept of effective publics comes from like this media scholar, which looks at it in the context of protests and social movements, just to, to precise that. And so what we looked at in the context of this 2020 article was the initiative Verändern, which was this anti-abortion initiative in Austria, where several different religious actors were taking part. So there was no denominational limitation to who took part in it. And I think this is something that we also see. I'm very glad you mentioned Citizen Go today, because I think also with Agenda Europe, we can see that there are a lot of different networks that also overlap in various instances where we see this certain Christian right becoming public. And the second one that we looked at was Awakening Austria, which was termed to be an evangelical event, but which was also happening with a lot of support from different religious traditions and religious actors of different denominations in Austria. So there weren't only like the evangelicals that organized it, but also other actors that were active. And then we looked at a third initiative, which kind of falls somehow out of the exact definition of initiatives, because we consider the Bleiboard event, which was now forbidden, I think, 1 month ago, and its history in the context of Austria, because also there we have actually different denominational actors taking part, even though it is mostly organized by the Croatian Catholic Church. So these were the these were the different initiatives that we looked at.
Thank you. Fair Ändern was run through Citizen Go. It ran on their website, no?
Yes, as this is exactly how Citizen Go, and also I think Agenda Europe work, that they have this citizen participation tools that they use in different countries on national, but also on EU level. And I think, yes, this is something that we will have to follow up closely.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Okay, some more questions? Please step in because I can't see everybody on the screen.
Herr Marco.
Ah, okay, yes.
I would like to ask you the more general question about the concept of fundamentalism. In particular, when you now compare what we have heard from Christina about the Russian Orthodoxy on the one hand and the new Christian right, isn't it all about traditional values? So how do you differentiate traditional values, orthodox not in the religious theological meaning, but orthodox in a very broader political meaning, values and behavior from fundamentalism?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a dividing line, conceptually speaking, between fundamentalist and traditionalist movements and ideas and values, or how do you see that?
Mm-hmm.
May I step in, because that would have been a little bit my question, because this right-wing side of Catholicism not only starts with Pope Francis, but goes back to the Second Vaticanum and the separation of Opus Dei and so on, and Pius Bruderschaft and whoever. So is this linked? This is, I think, combined to your question, Professor Marco.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think these are important questions, but they are not. I think they are not easy answerable, because for me, what I see when I do research in this domain is, on the one hand, this very clear history of US fundamentalism that has been exported globally into different contexts, as Christina Stöckel already mentioned somehow in the morning in her talk, where we also see these tendencies in Russian Orthodoxy. So there we have, of course, certain definitional criteria. For example, as Professor Marco already mentioned, the focus on so-called family values. So that is the term that people use for themselves, and they actually mean a restriction on reproductive or LGBTQI rights, with a very strong promotion of what we see as patriarchal family based on binary gender essentialisms. And I think what we see there is some kind of a very easy form of ecumenical relations, because I think these fundamentals are somehow easy to agree on for every fundamentalist, or what I would call fundamentalist Christian tradition. But I think it is very important to differentiate the different historical contexts where they emerge. And this is what I try to do with looking at the context, the historical context, very briefly, of course, only on the one hand within the Austrian history itself, but also with links to the history of the Catholic Church. So I think probably there is an easy way to say we have like a baseline fundamentalism definition. But I think linking it to case studies is very important to see the different historical contexts, or national contexts even, because on the one hand, they operate on a global level and they operate in networks. But on the other hand, the different actors still are very much rooted in their historical or national context. So this is the first part, I think, and the second part was the difference between traditionalism and fundamentalism, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think traditionalism is essential for this understanding of fundamentalism, because it is always a kind of a selective renewal or a selective radicalization of tradition. And this traditionalism or this understanding of traditionalism lies at the core of fundamentalist movements. But I think fundamentalism has to be understood as going a step further and creating everything around a traditional core. So I think every kind of fundamentalism has a traditionalist core, but not every traditionalism is necessarily to be deemed fundamentalist.
Do you think that this distinction has also to do with the very traditional distinction between the forum internum and the forum externum, so that traditionalism is transformed into fundamentalism if you start to mobilize people and to impose your traditional values on others?
Yeah, I think this is, of course, one of the ways we can
traditionalism
look at it.
would be when more like a Biedermeier or privatism, to say, well, my traditional values are very important for my private life and for my family life, but I'm not going to proselytize others.
Yeah, I think this is probably something also different definitions of fundamentalism actually do. So the moment it becomes the reason to transform or take action to transform the world in this image, plainly speaking.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks.
I don't see anybody now asking a question, and we would be exactly on time for a break. So last chance to step in. Okay, I think. So I give back the word to the organizers of the conference, and I thank Professor Modud and Dr. Limacher for the presentation very much. I think it was really interesting and important contribution to our theme. So back to the conference team, please.
Yeah, thank you so much. When I shall speak up on behalf of the conference team, this was a very interesting morning session with these two panels. I think we have tackled a broad range of subjects and topics and got a very good idea on different concepts, conceptualizations, and without having a chance now to give a summary of all the ideas and proposals which were made, I would like to stop here for the very moment, wish you a pleasant time for lunch, and we will start again at 2:15 with the third panel chaired by Max Lakic on the topic of religion, conflict, and transnational relations. And having said this, bon appetito, for everybody, and seeing you soon in 1.5 hours.